You need to move. Those 3 words, spoken with casual authority, would change aviation history forever. What followed wasn't just about airline discrimination. It was about what happens when someone mistakes a quiet, well-dressed black girl for someone who doesn't belong, and the devastating consequences that follow. Olivia Jackson was extraordinary in ways most people never got to see. At 12 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made adults take notice. Her dark eyes, always observant, seemed to absorb everything around her with unusual intensity. When she spoke, which wasn't often, her words carried the weight and precision of someone far beyond her years. But what truly set Olivia apart wasn't visible to casual observers. She lived with pulmonary arterial hypertension, PAH, a condition so rare and serious that most people had never heard of it. Her pulmonary vascular resistance measured at 14.3 Wood units, nearly 3 times the normal range. Her baseline oxygen saturation hovered at 93.7% with continuous assistance, while healthy people maintain 98–99% without effort. Her right ventricular systolic pressure measured 72 mmHg against a normal range of 15–25 mmHg, indicating severe right heart strain from chronically elevated pulmonary pressures. To understand Olivia's condition, you had to imagine your heart working harder and harder every day just to pump blood through arteries that were becoming narrower and stiffer. The mean pulmonary arterial pressure in her lungs was 47 mmHg, more than triple the normal 15 mmHg. Without proper treatment and precisely calibrated oxygen support, patients could die within minutes, not hours. Minutes. The slightest disruption to her carefully calibrated medical protocols could trigger a cascade of physiological events, ending in respiratory failure and right ventricular collapse. What made Olivia's story even more heartbreaking was that this was the same condition that had killed her mother, Angela Jackson. When Olivia was only 6 years old, Angela had been a respiratory therapist who understood her diagnosis better than most patients ever could. She recognized the distinctive pattern of progressive vascular remodeling in her own test results, the same pattern now appearing in her daughter's pulmonary scans. When Angela died on that rainy Tuesday morning in March, she left behind a promise from her husband, Colonel Marcus Jackson. If Olivia ever showed signs of the same condition, he would move heaven and earth to give her every chance at a normal life. The average survival time for pediatric pulmonary hypertension patients is 10.2 years from diagnosis. One specialist had told Marcus during a particularly bleak consultation. Marcus had stared back at him with steel in his eyes. "My daughter will not be average." Colonel Marcus Jackson wasn't just any worried father. At 45, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent 20 years in the military. His close-cropped hair had started graying at the temples, adding to his authoritative presence. After a distinguished career as an Air Force pilot, he had transitioned to become a senior operations director at the Federal Aviation Administration, overseeing aviation safety and regulatory compliance across the Midwest region. This man understood aviation law, federal regulations, and government authority better than almost anyone in the country. When Olivia was diagnosed at age 7 with the same condition that killed her mother, Marcus made good on his promise to Angela. He used every connection, every regulation, every protocol to ensure Olivia could live as normal a life as possible. He researched experimental treatments, consulted with specialists across the country, and became an expert on his daughter's condition, often surprising medical professionals with his detailed understanding of pulmonary vasodilator therapies and oxygen delivery systems. Olivia's medical equipment was sophisticated and essential. She carried a Novasphere P478 oxygen delivery system about the size of a laptop that delivered precisely calibrated oxygen to her lungs while monitoring her heart rate, oxygen saturation, and breathing patterns. The device maintained her inspired oxygen concentration at 38% with a flow rate of 4.7 liters per minute, parameters specifically calibrated to her unique physiological needs. The system monitored 16 different metrics, including pulmonary pressure estimates, right ventricular load indicators, and oxygenation efficiency indexes. Every beep, every light, every reading was literally a matter of life and death. The Novasphere maintained an electronic log of her physiological readings, transmitting critical data to her medical team in real time via a secured medical network using Protocol 47 Delta, a HIPAA-compliant transmission system. The slightest deviation from her baseline parameters triggered automatic alerts to both her local physicians and the specialized pulmonary hypertension team at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. But here's what made Olivia truly remarkable. She refused to let her condition define her limitations. "Dad, I don't want people to look at me and just see someone sick," she had told Marcus one evening after a particularly difficult day at school when other kids had stared at her equipment. "I want them to see me." So together, they had developed strategies to minimize the visibility of her condition. She wore specially designed clothing that camouflaged her medical tubes. She positioned her equipment to look like regular electronics. She practiced breathing techniques that minimized visible symptoms during minor episodes. Academically, Olivia was exceptional. Honor roll every semester, debate team captain who'd never lost a tournament. At 12 years old, she was already college-bound with dreams of becoming a biomedical engineer. Her personal statement, which she had been refining for months, opened with a powerful declaration. "I will design the device that saves the next generation of children like me." Her science project on miniaturized oxygen delivery systems had won the state championship and attracted attention from university researchers. Her understanding of pulmonary physiology surpassed that of many medical students. She could explain the intricate mechanics of gas exchange, vascular resistance, and cardiopulmonary dynamics with remarkable clarity. Inspired by her daily battle with the technology keeping her alive, Olivia had mastered what doctors call invisible disability. From the outside, she looked like any other beautiful, intelligent, well-dressed black girl. She didn't use a wheelchair, didn't walk with a cane, had no visible sign screaming medical patient. Only the occasional soft hum of her equipment gave any indication of her condition. This invisibility was usually a blessing. It allowed Olivia to navigate the world without constant stares, questions, or unwanted sympathy. But on April 17th, this invisibility would nearly kill her. That Tuesday morning, Olivia was flying from Chicago to San Francisco for the most important interview of her young life, an early admission interview at Stanford University's School of Engineering. The university had made a rare exception to meet with someone so young after reviewing her extraordinary research proposal on miniaturized respiratory support systems in the personal letter from Dr. James Hamilton, her pulmonologist, explaining the urgency of her situation. This wasn't just about early college admission. This was about joining the community of people dedicated to solving the exact medical problems she lived with every day. Stanford's biomedical engineering program was pioneering the next generation of portable life support devices that could transform lives like Olivia's. Their latest prototype PAH support system showed a 43% improvement in pulmonary vasodilation response compared to current models. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked as their car approached O'Hare International Airport, his eyes checking the rearview mirror to meet his daughter's gaze. "About the interview or the flight?" Olivia asked, her fingers absently checking the calibration on her Novasphere unit, verifying the PO2 settings were precisely at 157 mmHg. "Either, both. I've prepared for the interview for months," Olivia said with quiet confidence. "And you've prepared for the flight with military precision. So no, not nervous, just ready." She wasn't exaggerating about her father's preparation. Colonel Marcus Jackson had planned this trip with the thoroughness of a military operation. Every contingency had been addressed, every protocol followed, every risk mitigated with methodical attention to detail. The documentation alone filled a dedicated section of Olivia's carry-on bag, FAA medical equipment authorization form, number 8700-43B, physician statement of necessity, #D, OT 3872, medical device, air transportation's approval, FA, AMD 2D25-4721, and oxygen delivery system, flight safety certification, #TSA, ODS 372. Each document included specific technical parameters for her equipment, exact medical necessity justifications, and detailed accommodation requirements. Every document had been filed in triplicate with National Airways 45 days in advance, as required by Federal Aviation Regulation Part 382-103A. Every form had been reviewed and approved by Dr. Catherine Reyes, the airline's medical compliance officer, who had signed off on the specific accommodation requirements on March 3rd, exactly as required by DOT Policy Directive 2023-479. Every authorization carried official stamps, signatures, and verification codes that could be cross-referenced in both the FAA's Medical Accommodation Database and National Airways Passenger Manifest System. Marcus had even arranged a pre-flight consultation with the airline's Regional Director of Passenger Services to ensure zero complications with Olivia's seating, boarding, and in-flight accommodation needs. "Remember," Marcus said as they unloaded their luggage, "if anyone questions your equipment or seating assignment, you have my direct line, one touch on your emergency contact, and I can speak with them immediately. The call will automatically trigger GPS location tracking and emergency protocols at the FAA Command Center." The seat selection had been equally methodical. First-class seat 3A had been specifically chosen for its proximity to both the cabin crew station and the aircraft's emergency oxygen supply. More importantly, the first-class cabin maintained a pressure equivalent to 6,200 feet altitude, compared to economy's 8,300 feet, a critical difference for Olivia's compromised pulmonary system, representing approximately 17% lower effective altitude and correspondingly higher available oxygen. Her Novosphere P478 had been specifically calibrated for this pressure differential the previous day by Dr. Hamilton, who had adjusted the oxygen flow rate to 4.7 liters per minute with a 93% concentration level. The precise titration had been determined through pulmonary function testing, simulating both cabin pressure environments, with first class showing a 23.4% improvement in pulmonary vascular response. The unit carried a 17.4-hour battery life, plus 2 backup battery packs providing an additional 24 hours of operation, far more than the 4-hour and 17-minute scheduled flight duration. Each battery was certified under FAA Regulation 121-574-3 for air transport, and the power management system included redundant circuits to prevent any interruption in oxygen delivery. Colonel Jackson, the TSA supervisor, greeted them at the Special Assistance Security Lane. "Everything is prepared for Miss Olivia's screening. We've been fully briefed on her equipment. We'll be using Protocol 47B for continuous oxygen support during security processing." Marcus nodded appreciatively. His federal credentials and advanced coordination had ensured Olivia wouldn't face the indignity or danger of standard security screening, which could require temporary disconnection of her equipment. TSA Directive 1542. 10314 specifically outlined procedures for passengers with continuous life support needs, allowing for alternative screening methods that maintained uninterrupted operation. The specialized screening took exactly 7 minutes and 42 seconds, during which Olivia's vital signs were continuously monitored on the Novosphere's secondary display. Not a single alarm sounded. Not a single reading fluctuated beyond normal parameters. Everything proceeding as smoothly as Solomon Northup's life before betrayal in 12 Years a Slave. When stability masked approaching catastrophe, her oxygen saturation remained steady at 93.7%, heart rate at 72 BPM, and pulmonary pressure estimate at 47 mmHg, all within her acceptable baseline range. "You've done this before," the TSA agent commented as she completed the screening protocol. 27 times. Olivia answered precisely. "This is my 28th flight with medical equipment. I've flown this specific route 4 times previously." At gate C-17, the gate agent was expecting them. "Good morning, Miss Jackson," she said, checking her tablet. "I have all your documentation right here. You'll be boarding first, before our general pre-boarding announcement. I've noted the Novosphere P478 system with auxiliary power sources and alerted the cabin crew about your specific accommodation requirements." Olivia nodded, her expression serene, despite the significance of the moment. This wasn't just another flight. This was the flight that would take her to the interview that could shape her entire future. The interview that could give her access to the very researchers developing the next generation of devices that might someday extend her life. "Olivia," Marcus said, kneeling to meet his daughter's eyes. "I wish I could fly with you." "Dad, we discussed this. You have the Federal Safety Conference. It's important. Not as important as you. The conference is about preventing aviation accidents. That's thousands of lives. I'm just one person." Marcus shook his head, marveling at his daughter's perspective. "You're never just anything, Olivia. You're extraordinary." She smiled, the rare unguarded smile that momentarily revealed the 12-year-old behind the mature facade. "I've got this, Dad. 28 flights, remember? And Dr. Hamilton will meet me at SFO. The gate agent approached them. We're ready to begin boarding with Miss Jackson. I've already briefed the cabin crew about her medical accommodation requirements and first-class seating assignment. With practiced efficiency, Olivia gathered her carry-on bag containing her medications, backup equipment, and documentation. Her Novasphere unit hummed softly as she stood, the sound as natural to her as her own heartbeat. The custom-designed carrying case maintained the precise positioning of the device relative to her body, ensuring consistent oxygen delivery regardless of her movement. I'll call you when we land, she promised her father. I'll be tracking your flight's telemetry data through my federal dashboard, he replied, which made her smile again. Of course he would. As senior operations director, he had access to real-time flight data that most passengers never saw. Altitude, cabin pressure readings, estimated time of arrival down to the second. The boarding bridge seemed especially long today, but Olivia maintained her steady pace, her equipment trailing behind her on a specially designed cart that kept it at the precise height relative to her body. She had mastered the art of moving through the world connected to life support, making it look almost effortless. The flight attendant at the aircraft door greeted her with a professional smile. Good morning. Welcome aboard Flight 4721. Olivia presented her boarding pass, which displayed her seat assignment in the special code MSN ODS 472, indicating essential medical equipment. The flight attendant scanned it without comment and gestured toward the first-class cabin. Seat 3A is on your right. Let us know if you need any assistance with your equipment placement. With practice efficiency, Olivia settled into her seat and began her pre-flight routine. Secure the oxygen concentrator in the specialized holder. Check connection integrity at all 5 interface points. Test alarm systems at 3 sensitivity levels. Verify backup batteries showed full charge. And confirm emergency medications were accessible in the specifically designed compartment of her carry-on. The Novasphere's display confirmed stable operation, oxygen flow rate 4. 7 mmol, concentration 93%, battery life 52147 remaining. Pulmonary pressure estimate 47 mmHg, right? Ventricular workload, but index 3, 7 elevated but stable. Other passengers began boarding, filing past Olivia with the distracted expressions of people focused on their own journeys. Most didn't give her a second glance. A businessman in an expensive suit nodded politely as he took seat 2B, directly in front of her. A woman with platinum blonde hair and designer luggage settled into 3B, across the aisle, giving Olivia's equipment a curious look before turning her attention to her phone. To most observers, Olivia looked like any other girl with electronics, maybe a laptop, maybe a gaming device, exactly how she preferred it. Her medical tubes were discreetly positioned beneath her tailored navy blazer, the oxygen delivery running through a camouflage channel to her specially designed nasal cannula that was nearly invisible against her skin tone. She pulled out the Stanford School of Engineering introductory packet and began reviewing the biomedical engineering program's research on miniaturized respiratory support systems. The packet included a complex diagram of next-generation oxygen delivery technology utilizing nanotechnology filtration systems and artificial intelligence to dynamically adjust to changing physiological demands, technology that Olivia understood at a level most medical professionals never reached. She was patient and engineer, user and designer, survivor and innovator all in one. Is that engineering material? The businessman in 2B asked, glancing back at her reading. Biomedical engineering, Olivia confirmed. Stanford's program specifically focuses on respiratory support systems. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that someone so young would be studying university-level material. Impressive. Are you interested in that field? I'm interviewing with their early admission program tomorrow, she explained. My research proposal focuses on integrating machine learning algorithms with pulmonary pressure monitoring to create predictive response systems. The man looked genuinely impressed. Well, good luck. We need more bright minds in biomedical research. I'm Michael Reynolds. By the way, I work in healthcare investment. Olivia Jackson, thank you for the encouragement. Michael smiled politely and returned to his seat. The exchange was typical of her interactions with strangers. Initial surprise at her capabilities, followed by polite encouragement. She had learned to navigate these conversations with grace, neither calling attention to her medical condition nor hiding her intellectual abilities. The flight was filling up, the familiar sounds of overhead bins closing and pre-flight announcements beginning. Nobody paid much attention to the quiet black girl in first class reading a college textbook while connected to medical equipment. She was just another passenger on what was supposed to be a routine flight. But flight attendant Rebecca Wilson was about to make an assumption that would nearly kill Olivia and trigger the largest federal aviation investigation in decades. Rebecca Wilson had been working for National Airways for 8 years, all of them in first-class cabin service. At 42, she carried herself with the confident efficiency of someone who knew her job well and took pride in maintaining the standards expected in premium service. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect regulation bun, her uniform pressed to crisp perfection, her makeup subtle but flawless. She was, by most measures, good at her job. Passengers frequently commended her attention to detail, her ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, her knack for remembering regular travelers' preferences. She had received the airline's Service Excellence Award twice and had been selected to train new hires in premium cabin protocols. What her personnel file didn't show were the 17 passenger complaints filed against her in the past 2 years, 14 of them from passengers of color, 11 specifically related to seating verification incidents. These complaints had been systematically downgraded by management and buried in the company's resolved without action database, creating an official record that showed excellence while masking a troubling pattern. Rebecca Wilson also carried something else, unconscious biases about who belonged in first class and who didn't. These weren't biases she would ever acknowledge, even to herself. They were simply instincts developed over years of serving a predominantly white, predominantly wealthy clientele. In her mind, these weren't prejudices but quality control, ensuring the right passengers received the right experience. As Rebecca walked through the cabin doing her pre-flight check, she noticed something that didn't align with her mental template of a typical first-class passenger, a young black girl sitting in seat 3A, connected to what appeared to be electronic equipment, reading what looked like a textbook. Rebecca paused, her internal radar pinging with what she would later describe as concerns about passenger comfort and safety. To her unconscious bias, this didn't compute. Young black passengers, in her limited experience, didn't usually fly first class alone. They certainly didn't carry expensive-looking electronic equipment, and they definitely didn't read advanced textbooks. In Rebecca's mind, Olivia looked out of place. Wrong demographic, wrong age, wrong equipment. Something didn't add up. And Rebecca had been praised throughout her career for her attention to detail and maintaining cabin standards, corporate euphemisms that had reinforced her discriminatory instincts. "Excuse me, sweetheart," Rebecca said, approaching Olivia's seat with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you waiting for an adult to join you? Perhaps your parents are boarding soon?" Olivia looked up from her reading, momentarily confused by the question. "No, I'm traveling alone." Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see, and you're sure this is your assigned seat, first class?" "Yes," Olivia replied, reaching for her boarding pass. "Seat 3A." Rebecca glanced at the boarding pass but didn't take it for inspection. "That's unusual. We don't typically have unaccompanied minors in first class. These seats are generally reserved for our business travelers and premium customers." "I'm not registered as an unaccompanied minor," Olivia explained patiently. "I'm an experienced traveler with medical equipment. My father arranged everything with your airline's medical compliance office." This seemed to catch Rebecca's attention, though not in the way Olivia hoped. Rebecca's gaze shifted to the Novosphere unit, her expression hardening slightly. "Medical equipment, I wasn't informed about any medical equipment in the first-class cabin." Her tone carried an unmistakable note of suspicion. "I'll need to see your boarding pass and ID, please. We need to verify you're in the correct seat." Olivia handed over her boarding pass again, this time making sure Rebecca took it. "My documentation is in order. The gate agent verified everything, including my medical accommodation requirements." Rebecca examined the boarding pass with unusual scrutiny, turning it over as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. The special code MSN ODS 472, indicating approved medical equipment, was clearly visible, as was the first-class seat assignment. "Are you sure you're supposed to be in first class?" Rebecca asked again, despite the evidence in her hand. "These tickets are quite expensive, Is someone paying for this as some kind of special program or charity arrangement? The implication was clear. Rebecca couldn't imagine how a young black girl could afford a first-class ticket legitimately. My father booked this seat specifically because of my medical condition, Olivia explained, her voice remaining steady despite the growing discomfort of the situation. I have pulmonary arterial hypertension with a WHO Class 3 severity rating. This cabin section maintains pressure at levels compatible with my oxygen requirements. Medical condition, Rebecca repeated, looking at Olivia's equipment with new scrutiny. What exactly is all this equipment, and why wasn't I notified about a passenger with extensive medical needs in my cabin section? We should have been briefed pre-flight about something this serious. It's a Novasphere P478 oxygen delivery system, Olivia explained, gesturing to the device. It's FAA approved for all commercial flights under Regulation 121.574. I have complete documentation, including your airline's medical authorization form signed by Dr. Catherine Reyes. She reached for her carry-on bag where her medical authorization papers were stored, but Rebecca made no move to examine them. First class isn't really appropriate for passengers with complicated needs, Rebecca said, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. Our service is designed for business travelers who expect a certain environment. The equipment takes up space that our full-fare passengers might need. My medical needs won't interfere with other passengers, Olivia assured her above. My equipment is silent, and I've flown this way 27 times before without incident. National Airways has specifically approved this accommodation. The businessman in seat 2B, Michael Reynolds, had begun to notice the interaction. He turned slightly, his attention caught by Rebecca's increasingly skeptical tone. I'll need to verify this with the gate agent, Rebecca said, still holding Olivia's boarding pass. This doesn't seem right. We usually place passengers with special needs in other sections where there's more space for equipment. All my documentation was verified before boarding, Olivia reminded her. The airline's medical compliance officer approved everything 45 days ago, which exceeds your airline's 30-day advance notice requirement for oxygen devices. Young lady, Rebecca replied, her tone now openly condescending. I've been working first class for 8 years. I think I know our protocols better than you do. Our premium passengers pay thousands of dollars for a specific experience, which doesn't typically include medical equipment and children. With respect, Olivia replied carefully, medical equipment accommodation isn't a matter of cabin service protocols. It's governed by the Air Carrier Access Act and FAA Regulation 14 CFR 382.41, which specifically prohibits airlines from excluding passengers from any seat or cabin based on disability. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, unprepared for a 12-year-old to cite federal regulations. This unexpected knowledge seemed to reinforce her suspicion rather than alleviate it. Who was this child who knew airline regulations better than many flight attendants? Are you sure this is your seat? She asked for the third time, her tone now openly doubtful. First-class tickets for this route start at $1,700. That's a lot of money for someone your age to be traveling alone. The hesitation before someone your age made it clear she wasn't just referring to Olivia's youth. I have the correct boarding pass for this seat, Olivia reiterated, maintaining her composure. And I have medical authorization to use this equipment on this flight. Your airline approved my seating and accommodation requests weeks ago. Let me see some identification, Rebecca demanded, her voice rising slightly. I need to confirm you're supposed to be here and not in another section. Olivia reached into her bag and produced her student ID card. I don't have government ID because I'm 12, but all my medical documentation has my information. The paperwork was filed under my name and approved by your medical office. Rebecca barely glanced at the ID card. This doesn't prove anything. Anyone could have a student ID. For all I know, you've wandered in from coach looking for a better seat. By now, Michael Reynolds was openly watching the interaction, his brow furrowed with concern. Other nearby passengers had begun to notice as well, some pretending not to listen while catching every word. Is there a problem? Michael asked, directing his question to Rebecca. Sir, I'm handling a seating verification. Rebecca replied curtly. I need to ensure passengers are in their assigned seats before takeoff. She turned back to Olivia, her voice now carrying clearly to nearby seats. Look, Sweetie, first class isn't for everyone. These seats are reserved for our premium passengers who've actually paid for first class service. We can't have people wandering up from economy and claiming these seats. The statement hung in the air, laden with implications. Olivia felt her face warm with embarrassment as other passengers turned to stare, the public humiliation echoing Eliza's shame in 12 Years a Slave when her children were torn away, dignity stripped before witnesses. I have paid for first class, she said quietly. Or rather, my father did, and I have medical authorization to be here. Rebecca crossed her arms. I just find it unusual. In my experience, young people traveling alone don't typically fly first class, and they certainly don't carry complex electronic equipment. This isn't some kind of charity program where anyone can sit wherever they want because they have special needs. Olivia felt her heart rate increasing, not just from emotion, but from the physiological stress response that was particularly dangerous for someone with her condition. The Novosphere's display showed her heart rate had climbed from 72 to 83 beats per minute. Not dangerous yet, but a concerning trend. My medical equipment is essential life support, Olivia explained, trying to redirect the conversation to the most critical issue. It's calibrated specifically for this cabin's pressure environment. I can show you all the documentation. Rebecca reached down and touched the Novosphere unit without permission, examining its display with obvious skepticism. This looks very complex for someone your age to be operating. Are you sure you know how to use this? It seems like it should have adult supervision. The question was so absurd that Olivia momentarily couldn't respond. This was equipment she had been using daily for 5 years. Equipment that kept her alive. Equipment she understood better than most medical professionals. Yes, she finally said. I know how to use my life support equipment. Well, it seems excessive, Rebecca commented, still examining the device without permission. And really, if your condition is this serious, should you even be flying? It seems irresponsible. Michael Reynolds had heard enough. He unfastened his seatbelt and stood up, turning to face Rebecca directly. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his executive position. This young lady has clearly explained her situation. She has the correct boarding pass, medical equipment, and is trying to show you documentation. Is there some reason you keep questioning her right to be here? Rebecca straightened, clearly surprised by the intervention. Sir, as I said, I'm simply verifying proper seating. This is unusual, and what exactly is unusual, Michael pressed? That she's young, that she has medical equipment, or is it something else? The implication was clear, and Rebecca's face flushed. I'm just doing my job. Safety is our priority, and unexpected medical equipment raises concerns. Her equipment was approved in advance, Michael pointed out. She's told you that multiple times. Have you actually looked at her documentation? Rebecca's defensive posture intensified. Sir, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone when a child with medical needs is being harassed, Michael replied firmly. I'd like to see your supervisor or the captain. Other passengers had begun to notice now, some openly staring, others pretending not to watch while catching every word. A woman across the aisle had discreetly taken out her phone and appeared to be recording the interaction. Rebecca leaned closer to Olivia, her voice low but intense. This is first class. We have standards. Not everyone belongs here. The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. Not everyone belongs here. The implication was unmistakable. The Novosphere unit emitted a soft beep, the first warning that Olivia's vital signs were changing. Her heart rate had climbed to 93 beats per minute, and her oxygen saturation had dropped from its baseline of 93.7% to 91.4%. Not dramatic changes yet, but concerning trends for someone with her condition. My medical documentation is all here, Olivia said, pulling out the folder containing her authorizations. Everything was approved weeks ago. I have official National Airways medical authorization forms signed by your compliance officer. Rebecca barely glanced at the offered folder. Those could be anything. Anyone can print official-looking papers. For all I know, this is some kind of scam to get free upgrades. The Novosphere beeped again, heart rate 103 BPM. Oxygen saturation 89.2%. The confrontation was just beginning, but Olivia's medical crisis had already started. The Novasphere P478 was programmed with tiered alert protocols based on Olivia's specific physiological baseline. The first gentle beeps indicated minor deviations from her normal readings, early warning signs that might not alarm a casual observer, but were immediately recognizable to someone familiar with pulmonary arterial hypertension. The device's internal algorithm recognized the pattern of increasing heart rate and decreasing oxygen saturation as potentially dangerous for someone with Olivia's condition. It automatically increased oxygen flow from 4.7 to 5.2 liters per minute and adjusted the concentration from 93% to 95%, compensating for her increased respiratory demand. Olivia recognized the warning signs in her own body before the machine even detected them. The subtle tightness in her chest that signaled pulmonary vasoconstriction. The slight increase in breathing effort as her right ventricle worked harder against rising pulmonary resistance. The barely perceptible tingling in her fingertips that indicated decreased peripheral oxygenation. After years of living with pulmonary arterial hypertension, her body awareness was extraordinary. She needed to de-escalate this situation immediately. "Miss Wilson," Olivia said, using Rebecca's name from her identification badge. "I understand your concerns about proper verification. I'm happy to show you my medical authorization from National Airways Compliance Department. Everything was approved 45 days ago through your airline's medical accommodation office." She again offered the folder containing her documentation, her hands steady despite the growing distress in her body. The folder contained form #FAA-MD 2025-4721 with her name, flight details, and specific accommodation requirements, signed by Dr. Catherine Reyes, National Airways Regional Medical Compliance Officer. Rebecca finally took the folder, but barely opened it before shaking her head dismissively. "These forms could be anything. I need to see official airline documentation specific to this flight, not general medical papers. Those are official airline forms," Michael pointed out from seat 2B. Having returned to a seated position but still actively engaged in the situation, the National Airways logo is right there on the letterhead, along with Dr. Reyes' signature and compliance verification code, NWMD 400-7293. Rebecca ignored him, focusing her attention back on Olivia. "Look, even if these papers are legitimate, which I'm not convinced they are, there's another issue. Your equipment is taking up too much space. It's creating a potential hazard in the first-class cabin where our premium passengers need adequate room." This was demonstrably false. The Novasphere unit sat neatly beside Olivia's seat, secured to her specialized carry-on and taking up no more space than a standard laptop bag. It was positioned specifically to avoid creating any obstruction and complied with all FAA size requirements for in-cabin medical devices. "My equipment meets all FAA size requirements for in-cabin medical devices," Olivia replied, her breathing now slightly more labored. "It's properly secured and doesn't extend into any walkway. The dimensions are 9.7 inches by 11, 3 inches by 4 to 2 inches, well within the permitted size for essential medical equipment under FAA Regulation 14 CFR 382-67. The Novasphere beeped again, this time with a slightly different tone. Oxygen saturation had dropped to 87.2%. The machine automatically increased flow to 5.8 liters per minute and adjusted the oxygen-nitrogen ratio to compensate for decreased hemoglobin binding efficiency. "What's that beeping?" Rebecca demanded. "Is your machine malfunctioning? We can't have malfunctioning electronic equipment on board during flight." "It's adjusting to my physiological readings," Olivia explained, trying to keep her voice calm despite growing discomfort. "The stress of this conversation is affecting my vital signs. My heart rate has increased from 72 to 114 beats per minute, and my oxygen saturation has dropped to 87.2%, which triggers automatic flow adjustments. So your equipment is making noise that will disturb other passengers," Rebecca concluded, completely missing the medical implications. "That's exactly why we need to address this situation before takeoff. First-class passengers expect a quiet, premium experience." The woman across the aisle, who had been recording discreetly, spoke up. "She's clearly having some kind of medical issue. Maybe you should be helping her instead of questioning her right to be here." Rebecca turned sharply. "Ma'am, please don't record this interaction. It's against airline policy to film crew members without permission. I'll need you to delete that recording immediately." Actually, Michael interjected, National Airways policy only prohibits recording safety demonstrations and crew emergency procedures as stated in your in-flight magazine on page 47. Passenger interactions are not covered under that policy, particularly when they involve potential civil rights violations. Rebecca's frustration was visibly mounting. Sir, I've asked you repeatedly to stay out of this matter. This doesn't concern you. She turned back to Olivia. And you need to understand that first class is reserved for our premium passengers who pay significant fares for a certain experience. This isn't a charity program for people with special needs. The statement hung in the air, its implication unmistakable to everyone listening. A few gasps came from nearby passengers. Someone whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Olivia's Novosphere now showed concerning readings, heart rate 114 BPM. Oxygen saturation 85.7%, blood pressure elevated at 142/94 mmHg, pulmonary pressure estimate 57 mmHg, a 21% increase from her baseline. I need to remain calm, Olivia said, more to herself than anyone else. My medical condition requires it. She tried to implement the breathing techniques Dr. Hamilton had taught her, but the physiological stress response was overwhelming her conscious control. Your condition is precisely why you shouldn't be in first class, Rebecca insisted. If you need this much medical equipment and special accommodation, you probably shouldn't be flying at all. National Airways can't be responsible for passengers with such severe medical issues. Michael stood up again. That's discrimination. You're suggesting she shouldn't fly because she has a medical condition. That's a direct violation of the Air Carrier Access Act, which specifically prohibits airlines from refusing transport to people with disabilities. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. I'm suggesting that if her condition is so serious that a simple conversation triggers medical alarms, she needs proper medical attention, not a luxury flight. First class isn't about luxury for me, Olivia explained, her breathing now visibly labored. It's about the cabin pressure differential. Economy class maintains pressure equivalent to 8,300 feet altitude. First class is 6,200 feet. My equipment is calibrated for this specific environment. Moving to economy would be medically dangerous. That sounds made up, Rebecca scoffed. I've never heard of different cabin pressures in different sections of the same aircraft. That's not how airplanes work. Several passengers exchanged glances, clearly aware that what Olivia had described was indeed accurate. Modern wide-body aircraft like the Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 did maintain slightly different pressure environments between cabins, a fact well known among frequent flyers and aviation professionals. The Novosphere emitted a new alert tone, higher pitched and more insistent. Oxygen saturation 83.4%, heart rate 126 BPM, right ventricular strain indicator elevated. The machine now displayed a yellow warning indicator, suggesting immediate intervention was needed to prevent further deterioration. I need you to move to economy, Rebecca announced suddenly. Your equipment is causing a disruption with these alarms, and I need these seats available for passengers who actually paid for first-class service. There's an empty middle seat in row 27 that should accommodate your equipment. Olivia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her as her pulmonary blood vessels constricted further in response to stress, reducing oxygen transfer efficiency to her brain. Her condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected, the confrontation triggering vasoconstrictive responses that further restricted blood flow through her lungs. I can't move, she said, her voice now noticeably strained. Moving would be medically dangerous. The different cabin pressure in economy would require recalibration of my equipment, which can only be done on the ground with special equipment. My pulmonary arterial pressure is already at 57 mmHg, which is critically elevated. This is ridiculous, Rebecca declared loudly. First, you claim to belong in first class with a ticket that costs more than most people earn in a week. Then you have mysterious medical equipment that's suddenly beeping and flashing. Now you claim you can't move to another perfectly good seat because of some made-up science about cabin pressure. This isn't how things work on my flights. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her emergency medication pouch. Inside was an inhaled prostacyclin analog that could help relax her pulmonary blood vessels in emergencies. She'd never had to use it on a flight before. Please, she said, her voice weakening. Check with the captain or the gate agent. My documentation is legitimate. My medical needs are real. Moving me could cause a severe pulmonary hypertensive crisis. Rebecca reached out and picked up Olivia's Stanford information packet. College materials. You're what? 10 years old. This is becoming more suspicious by the minute. Are you trying to pretend you're a college student too? I'm 12, Olivia corrected, and I'm interviewing with Stanford's biomedical engineering program. My research proposal on miniaturized oxygen delivery systems was accepted for early review. Of course you are, Rebecca replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. And I suppose next you'll tell me you're a doctor too. Look, this charade has gone on long enough. Either move to economy class where there's more room for your equipment, or I'll have to involve the captain and security. The Novosphere alarm changed again, now a steady, more urgent tone. Oxygen saturation by 2%, heart rate 135 BPM, pulmonary pressure estimate 63 mmHg. The display had turned from yellow to orange, indicating a serious medical situation developing. By now, several passengers were openly recording the interaction. Someone in the row behind Olivia could be heard making a phone call, describing the situation in urgent whispers. There's a flight attendant harassing a black girl with medical equipment. Yes, she's ignoring the medical alarms. No, she's demanding she move to economy, even though the girl says it's dangerous. Michael stood again, this time moving into the aisle to face Rebecca directly. This has gone far enough. This young lady is clearly in medical distress. Your questioning is making it worse. I want to speak to the captain immediately. Rebecca squared her shoulders. Sir, return to your seat right now or I'll have you removed from this flight for interfering with the crew member duties. Section 91.11 of Federal Aviation Regulations prohibits interference with crew members. Your duty is passenger safety, Michael responded, not backing down. And you're actively endangering a passenger with medical needs. That's a violation of your own airline safety protocols as well as federal regulations protecting passengers with disabilities. Nearby passengers murmured in agreement, several nodding visibly. A woman with a small child whispered to her husband, "This is horrible. That poor girl can barely breathe, and this flight attendant is treating her like a criminal. I need to speak to someone else," Olivia managed to say between increasingly labored breaths. "Please get another flight attendant or the captain. My condition is deteriorating rapidly." "Listen, little girl," Rebecca said, her patience evidently exhausted. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is first class. You need to gather your things and move to the back of the plane where you belong." Where you belong, the words hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. The woman recording across the aisle said something that sounded like, "Oh my God, did she really just say that?" into her phone. A man in row 4 stood up and called out, "Hey, that's not right." Olivia's medical crisis was escalating rapidly now. The stress of the confrontation, the humiliation of being questioned so publicly, the physical strain of arguing while connected to life support, all of it was pushing her into a dangerous medical state. Her Novosphere display now showed critical readings: oxygen saturation 79.3%, heart rate 147 BPM, pulmonary pressure estimates 68 mmHg, right ventricular strain indicator severe. The alarm was steady and unmistakable. The display fully orange with warnings flashing. "I can't breathe properly," Olivia gasped, reaching for her emergency inhaler. "Please, I just need to stay in my assigned seat. Moving will cause a pulmonary hypertensive crisis." "That's enough," Rebecca snapped. Security bomb. She was calling for the air marshal or security personnel, treating Olivia as a threat rather than a passenger in medical distress. Michael was now fully in the aisle, positioning himself between Rebecca and Olivia in a protective stance. "Are you completely out of your mind? This child is having a medical emergency. She needs help, not security." Her lips are turning blue. Other passengers had begun taking sides. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around to glare at Rebecca. "What is wrong with you? Can't you see she's struggling to breathe? This is a child in medical distress." An older man nearby nodded in agreement. "My grandson has asthma. I know what respiratory distress looks like. She needs medical attention immediately." Not an argument about seating. But a few passengers seemed to support Rebecca's position. If she's too sick to fly, she shouldn't be here. one muttered. It's not fair to put everyone else at risk. The cabin was dividing into factions, all while Olivia's condition deteriorated further. The Novosphere had now switched to its emergency protocol, delivering maximum oxygen concentration 99% at 2 liters per minute and triggering its distress beacon, a feature designed to alert medical professionals that a patient was in crisis. Olivia's phone, sitting in her lap, started ringing. The caller ID displayed exactly what would change everything. Dad, FAA emergency line. Rebecca noticed the phone. You need to put that away immediately. We're about to take off and cell phones need to be in airplane mode. That's a federal regulation. Olivia tried to reach for her phone, but the combination of physical weakness and being connected to her equipment made it difficult. Her hands trembled as she struggled to grasp the device, her fingertips showing visible cyanosis, the bluish discoloration that indicated severe oxygen deprivation. Michael, seeing her difficulty, asked gently, "Can I help you with that?" Olivia nodded weakly, and Michael carefully took the phone from her lap. "Hello," Michael answered, his voice professional and urgent. "Olivia," came the concerned voice of Colonel Marcus Jackson. "Sweetheart, is everything okay? The Novosphere monitoring system is showing alert status. Your pulmonary pressure reading just hit 68 mmHg. Sir, this isn't Olivia," Michael explained quickly. "My name is Michael Reynolds. I'm a passenger in Seat 2B on National Airways Flight 4721. Your daughter is having some kind of medical emergency, and the flight attendant is trying to force her to move seats instead of helping her." There was complete silence on the other end of the line for exactly 3 seconds. "Put me on speaker," came the voice, suddenly sharp with authority. "Now." Michael pressed the speaker button and held the phone where everyone nearby could hear. "This is Colonel Marcus Jackson, Senior Operations Director, Federal Aviation Administration. Who am I speaking with?" Rebecca Wilson's face went white. She recognized that tone, the voice of federal authority, the kind of power that could end careers with a single phone call. This is Rebecca Wilson, Senior Flight Attendant on Flight 4721. "Ms. Wilson Bucket," Colonel Jackson's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "I need you to explain to me why my daughter, who is traveling with federally approved medical equipment and complete documentation, is apparently being asked to move from her assigned first-class seat while experiencing a medical emergency." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She was beginning to realize the magnitude of her mistake, but she was too committed to back down gracefully. "Sir, I was just following protocol. Your daughter's equipment was causing a disruption with its alarms, and first-class passengers expect a quiet, premium environment." "What protocol?" Colonel Jackson's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "What National Airways protocol allows you to question a passenger's seat assignment based on their appearance? What protocol allows you to ignore medical equipment that is clearly visible and properly documented? What protocol permits you to continue harassment when a passenger's medical device is alerting with life-threatening readings?" The authority in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a concerned parent. This was a senior federal official who knew exactly what regulations applied and had the power to enforce them. Olivia's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort. The Novosphere unit was now in full alarm mode, its display flashing with warning indicators that even untrained observers could recognize as serious. The numbers told a frightening story. Oxygen saturation 77.1%, heart rate 153 BPM, pulmonary pressure estimate 72 mmHg, right ventricular strain indicator severe. "Dad," she whispered into the phone, "I can't. It's hard to breathe." The change in Marcus Jackson's voice was immediate and terrifying. He went from federal official to desperate father in an instant. "Olivia, baby, I need you to focus on your breathing. Is your Novosphere working properly? Is it delivering oxygen at the emergency protocol rate?" "Yes, but she wants to move me. Different cabin, different pressure, recalibration required." "I understand, sweetheart. Don't move. Help is coming. I'm activating emergency protocols now." Michael Reynolds, who had been listening to this entire exchange, turned to face Rebecca Wilson directly. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he said, loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "This child is on life support. Her father is a federal aviation official. And you're trying to move her because you don't think she looks like she belongs in first class. Do you have any idea what you've done? Other passengers were fully engaged now. At least 7 phones were recording from multiple angles. A young woman in row 4 was live streaming to her social media followers, her narration clearly audible. And the flight attendant is ignoring a medical emergency because she doesn't believe a black girl should be in first class. The girl's oxygen levels are dropping while this woman is arguing about seating. Yeah, comments were already flooding in on the live stream. OMG, is this real? Someone call 911. This is straight up racism. National Airways, what is happening on Flight 4721? Call the FAA now. The view count was climbing exponentially: 3,427, 5,819, 8,742. People were sharing the stream as fast as it was loading. Rebecca tried once more to regain control of the situation. Sir, I need to maintain order in the cabin. The passenger's equipment is causing a disruption that could potentially— Maintain order, Michael exploded. You're discriminating against a child with a disability. You're endangering her life because of your racial bias. Her oxygen saturation is at 77% and dropping. Do you understand what that means medically? The words racial bias echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Every passenger was watching now. This wasn't just about seating arrangements anymore. This was about a black child being discriminated against while fighting for her life. Meanwhile, Colonel Marcus Jackson was mobilizing federal resources from his office in Washington. Sarah, he called to his assistant, his voice carrying through the speakerphone. I need you to ground Flight 4721 immediately. Medical emergency involving crew discrimination against a disabled minor. Authorization code Jackson Alpha 7429. Sir. Sarah sounded confused by the urgency in his voice. Do it now. That's my daughter on that plane. And some flight attendant is trying to kill her with ignorance and racism. Initiate Protocol 47 Delta. Full federal response. Within seconds, the wheels of the Federal Aviation Authority were turning. Sarah Delgado made 3 calls that would change commercial aviation forever. Call 1 Air Traffic Control Command Center. This is the FAA Director's Office. Flight 4721 at O'Hare is grounded under Direct Federal Order Authorization Code Jackson Alpha 7429. Do not allow departure. Implement Terminal Departure Control Code 1782. Call 2 O'Hare Emergency Medical. Dispatch Pediatric Emergency Team with pulmonary hypertension expertise to Gate C-17. Federal officials' daughter in medical crisis due to crew actions. Patient has pulmonary arterial hypertension with deteriorating vital signs. Pulmonary pressure 72 mmHg and rising. Call 3 National Airways Corporate Headquarters. This is the FAA Director's Office. You have a discrimination incident involving a federal official's disabled daughter on Flight 4721. Your crew is actively endangering a minor with documented medical needs. Federal investigation is being initiated under FAA Regulation 91-13 for careless operation and 14 CFR 382.19 for disability discrimination. Back on the plane, Olivia's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The stress, the humiliation, the physical strain of arguing while connected to life support was pushing her into respiratory failure. Dad, she gasped into the phone, her voice barely audible. I think I need help. My right ventricle. Hold on, baby. Help is coming. I'm coming. Just hold on. Medical teams are being dispatched right now. The Novosphere display now showed critical readings: oxygen saturation 75.8%, heart rate 158 BPM, blood pressure 156/102, pulmonary pressure estimate 76 mmHg. The machine was delivering maximum oxygen support, but Olivia's compromised pulmonary system couldn't keep up with the physiological demands of her stress response. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and the pulse oximeter on her finger was flashing with urgent warnings. The device was doing everything it could, but the biological reality of pulmonary hypertension meant that her blood vessels were constricting further under stress, creating a dangerous cycle of decreasing oxygen transfer and increasing cardiac strain. Rebecca Wilson was starting to panic. She was realizing that she had just discriminated against the daughter of a senior federal aviation official, endangered a child's life, and done it all while passengers recorded everything on their phones. Perhaps, she said weakly, we can work something out. If the medical condition is as serious as it appears, we can make an accommodation. Work something out. Michael Reynolds was livid. You just spent 15 minutes trying to force a child on life support to move seats because she's black and you didn't think she belonged in first class. What exactly do you want to work out now that her father, a federal official, is on the phone and she's in medical distress? The live stream had exploded. The hashtag Flight 4721 was trending nationally, with over 47,000 viewers watching in real time as Olivia fought to breathe while Rebecca Wilson stood over her. Comments were pouring in faster than the screen could display. This is a federal crime happening in real time. Someone save that child. FA and National Airways, what is happening here? This flight attendant needs to be arrested. Discrimination against a disabled minor is a federal offense. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, hearing the commotion from the cockpit, came back to see what was happening. What she found was a flight attendant standing over a distressed black child connected to medical equipment in obvious crisis. While passengers recorded the confrontation and a federal official's voice boomed from a phone on speaker. "What's going on here?" Captain Rodriguez demanded, her expression changing from professional concern to alarm as she saw the medical equipment in emergency mode. "Captain," Michael Reynolds said before Rebecca could speak, "your flight attendant has been trying to force this young lady to give up her assigned first-class seat. She's connected to life support equipment for pulmonary hypertension. She has all proper documentation, and her father is a senior FAA official who's currently on speakerphone." Captain Rodriguez looked at Olivia, clearly in medical distress, obviously connected to legitimate medical equipment. The documentation folder open on her lap with official FAA and National Airways letterheads clearly visible. Then she looked at Rebecca Wilson, who was standing there like she'd just realized she'd stepped on a landmine. "Wilson, Mahala," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, "please return to your station immediately." "But, Captain, immediately." That's when the radio crackled with a message that had never been heard in commercial aviation history. "Flight 4721, this is Chicago Ground Control. You are ordered to return to gate immediately under Direct Federal Order Authorization Code Jackson Alpha 7429. Do not proceed with departure. Medical emergency and federal investigation in progress. Acknowledge." Captain Rodriguez looked around the cabin at Olivia struggling to breathe, at the passengers recording everything, at the phone still connected to a federal official who was clearly mobilizing resources to protect his daughter. "Ground Control, this is National 4721. Acknowledged. Returning to gate for medical emergency and federal investigation." She keyed the cabin announcement system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're returning to the gate due to a medical emergency. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But the announcement that came next changed everything. "Flight 4721, this is not a routine return to the gate. This is a federal investigation into crew discrimination against a disabled minor under Terminal Departure Control Code 1782. All passengers will be accommodated on later flights after providing witness statements. All crew members are to remain in place for federal questioning. Chicago Center is dispatching air traffic recording of this federal order for your flight data recorder. Acknowledge. Ground Control, National 4721. Acknowledged. Federal investigation understood. Returning to gate immediately." Rebecca Wilson's career had just ended. Olivia Jackson's fight for her life was just beginning. And Colonel Marcus Jackson was about to show the world what happens when you mess with a federal foreign official's child. The phone was still connected when Marcus said the words that would become legendary in aviation circles, "Miss Wilson, in approximately 30 minutes, you're going to be questioned by federal investigators about why you nearly killed my daughter because you didn't think she looked like she belonged in first class. I suggest you use that time to find a good lawyer. Federal criminal negligence under 18 U.S.C. 1112 carries a maximum sentence of 8 years." As Flight 4721 returned to the gate, as federal investigators prepared to board, as social media exploded with outrage, Olivia Jackson was fighting for every breath while connected to the equipment that kept her alive. But her father wasn't just coming to comfort her. He was coming to make sure that no other child would ever face discrimination that could cost them their life. The reckoning was about to begin. When Flight 4721 returned to Gate C-17, it wasn't just returning to unload passengers. It was returning to face the full weight of federal investigation that would reshape the aviation industry forever. The aircraft had barely connected to the jetway when the first response team arrived. This wasn't a routine medical call. This was a federally coordinated emergency response to a life-threatening situation involving a minor. The team was led by Dr. Elena Ramirez, a pediatric pulmonologist from Northwestern Memorial Hospital who specialized in pulmonary arterial hypertension. Federal Medical Response Team, Dr. Ramirez announced as she boarded, flanked by 2 specialized respiratory therapists and a cardiac emergency specialist. "We're here for Olivia Jackson. Where is she?" Michael Reynolds waved urgently from his position beside Olivia's seat. "Here, she's here in 3A. Dr. Ramirez took one look at Olivia's condition and knew this could have been fatal. The Novosphere readings told a frightening story. Oxygen saturation 74.2%, heart rate 162 beat, pulmonary pressure estimate 78 mmHg, right ventricular strain indicator severe. "How long has she been in respiratory distress?" Dr. Ramirez asked, immediately connecting additional monitoring equipment to Olivia's existing lines. "About 25 minutes, Michael replied, checking his watch. "Ever since the flight attendant started harassing her about her seat." Dr. Ramirez checked Olivia's peripheral circulation, noting the cyanosis in her fingertips and lips. "This is a critical situation for someone with pulmonary arterial hypertension. We're looking at imminent right ventricular failure if we don't reverse the pulmonary pressure spike." She turned to her team. "I need 25 micrograms of intravenous epiprostenol prepared immediately. Let's get a direct pulmonary pressure line established and prepare for possible intubation if her numbers don't stabilize." The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, administering emergency vasodilator medications through Olivia's existing lines, adjusting her oxygen delivery, and preparing her for immediate transport to the hospital. "Her pulmonary vascular resistance is dangerously elevated," Dr. Ramirez noted, reviewing the Novosphere's detailed readouts. "We're seeing 14.8 Wood units, which indicates severe vasoconstriction. The stress response has essentially doubled the resistance in her pulmonary circuit." While the medical team worked to stabilize Olivia, a second team boarded the aircraft. This wasn't a routine security response. This was a full federal investigation unit led by FBI Special Agent Thomas Hernandez, accompanied by FAA safety investigators, Department of Transportation civil rights officers, and airline industry oversight officials from 3 different federal agencies. "This is now a federal investigation scene," Agent Hernandez announced to the cabin. "All passengers are asked to remain in their seats. We will be collecting statements and video evidence from everyone who witnessed the incident." He approached Rebecca Wilson, who stood frozen near the galley. "Ms. Wilson, I'm Special Agent Hernandez with the FBI Civil Rights Division. You are being questioned under federal authority regarding discrimination against a disabled passenger and endangerment of a minor in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code 242 and 1112. You have the right to have airline representation present, but this is not an optional interview." Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear. 12 hours earlier, she'd been a senior flight attendant with what she believed was a clean record. Now she was facing federal charges that could include civil rights violations and endangering the life of a child. I was just following protocol," Rebecca stammered, her voice barely audible. "What specific protocol requires you to question a passenger's seat assignment based on their appearance?" Agent Hernandez asked, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes intense. "What protocol allows you to ignore medical equipment and documentation? What protocol permits continued harassment after a passenger shows signs of medical distress?" She seemed what? "Miss Wilson?" Rebecca's shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't look like she belonged in first class. And what exactly does someone who belongs in first class look like? "Miss Wilson." The question hung in the air, impossible to answer without revealing the bias that had driven Rebecca's actions. While Rebecca was being questioned, federal agents were moving through the cabin, collecting video recordings from passengers. At least 27 different passengers had captured portions of the incident from various angles. Each recording was being logged into an evidence management system with precise timestamps and chain of custody documentation. "Sir, I'm Agent Maria Lopez," a federal officer said to Michael Reynolds. "We'd like to take your statement about what you witnessed." Michael provided a detailed account, his corporate background giving him the vocabulary to articulate exactly what he had observed. The discrimination was blatant and escalating, he explained. Ms. Wilson made multiple comments implying Olivia didn't belong in first class. She questioned whether Olivia could afford the ticket. She suggested Olivia was lying about her medical condition, and she explicitly told Olivia to move to the back of the plane where you belong. Did Ms. Wilson check Olivia's documentation when it was offered? Agent Lopez asked. No, Michael confirmed. Olivia tried to show her medical authorization paperwork at least 3 times, and Ms. Wilson barely glanced at it. She dismissed it as potentially fraudulent without actually examining it. In your estimation, was Ms. Wilson aware that Olivia was in medical distress? Absolutely, Michael replied without hesitation. The medical device was alarming audibly. The display was showing emergency warnings in orange and red. Olivia was visibly struggling to breathe. Her lips were turning blue. Multiple passengers pointed this out. Miss Wilson dismissed these concerns and actually called for security instead of medical assistance. Meanwhile, a third team had arrived at the gate. This one led by Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Dr. Maria Gonzalez from the Department of Transportation. She immediately established a command center in the gate area to coordinate the multi-agency response. We have initiated Protocol 47 Delta, Dr. Gonzalez informed her team. Full federal civil rights investigation with presumption of disability discrimination. I want every piece of evidence cataloged and secured. We're treating this as both a civil rights violation and a criminal endangerment case. Protocol 47 Delta was rarely invoked. It bypassed normal investigation procedures and allowed for immediate federal intervention when there was credible evidence of discrimination that posed an immediate threat to life or safety. The protocol authorized agents to seize evidence, obtain statements, and implement emergency regulatory actions without the usual administrative delays. The airline's corporate response team had arrived via emergency helicopter, led by Senior Vice President of Operations, Richard Whitman. His face was ashen as he was briefed on the situation. National Airways will cooperate fully with the investigation, Whitman assured Dr. Gonzalez. We're as shocked and concerned as everyone else about what appears to have happened. Mr. Whitman, Dr. Gonzalez replied coolly, we'll need immediate access to all crew training records, disability accommodation protocols, and Ms. Wilson's complete personnel file, including any previous passenger complaints. Of course, Whitman agreed quickly. Whatever you need. On the aircraft, Dr. Ramirez had managed to stabilize Olivia enough for transport. We've brought her pulmonary pressure down to 65 miles, which is still dangerously high, but no longer immediately life-threatening. We need to get her to Northwestern Memorial immediately for comprehensive evaluation. As the medical team prepared to move Olivia, Colonel Marcus Jackson arrived. He had been flown directly from Washington, D.C. to Chicago on a government aircraft. The flight expedited with emergency clearance. The man who walked onto the plane wasn't just a worried father. He was a federal official in full-dress uniform, his authority evident in every movement. Where is my daughter, he asked, his voice controlled but vibrating with intensity. Dr. Ramirez directed him to where Olivia lay, now on a specialized medical transport stretcher with enhanced monitoring equipment. Dad, Olivia whispered, her voice weak but her eyes brightening at his presence. Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hand carefully to avoid disturbing the medical lines. I'm here, baby. You're going to be okay. The best medical team is taking care of you. Ramirez spoke quietly. Colonel Jackson, we've stabilized her for now, but she needs comprehensive care at the hospital. The stress-induced pulmonary crisis has caused significant strain on her right ventricle. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. Do whatever is necessary. I want the best care possible. As the medical team prepared to transport Olivia, Marcus stood and turned to face Rebecca Wilson, who was still being questioned by federal agents. The room seemed to freeze as he approached, his military bearing and federal authority creating an almost palpable field of power around him. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of tightly controlled fury. You should know that my daughter's condition matches her mother's before she died. The same pulmonary vascular resistance pattern, the same cardiac stress markers. The stress you caused today has created new damage that may be irreversible. Rebecca's face crumpled as the full impact of her action began to register. She wasn't just facing professional consequences or legal charges. She had potentially shortened the life of a child. I I didn't know, she whispered. You didn't ask. Marcus replied simply. You saw a young black girl and decided she didn't belong in first class. You didn't check her documentation. You didn't listen to her explanations. You didn't respect her medical needs. And now my daughter is fighting for her life. Again. He turned to Agent Hernandez. I want the full weight of the federal prosecution, civil rights violations, criminal negligence, endangerment of a disabled minor. Everything. Yes, sir. Agent Hernandez confirmed. We're already coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. This will be prosecuted at the federal level. Marcus then addressed Dr. Gonzalez from the Department of Transportation. I want a complete investigation into National Airways training practices, discrimination complaints, and disability accommodation protocols. If what happened to Olivia is part of a pattern, I want to know. Dr. Gonzalez nodded. We've already initiated Protocol 47 Delta, full regulatory review with presumption of systemic noncompliance. National Airways will have to prove they meet federal standards across all operations, not just address this single incident. Meanwhile, the social media explosion continued unabated. The hashtag Justice for Olivia had joined hashtag Flight 4721 in trending nationally. Live streams of the federal response had been viewed by over 2.3 million people within the hour. News organizations had dispatched teams to O'Hare, and the story was breaking across all major networks. As Olivia was being transported to the ambulance, passengers were watching with a mix of horror and concern. Many had been moved to tears by what they'd witnessed, both the discrimination and the life-threatening medical crisis it had triggered. Michael Reynolds approached Marcus before leaving the aircraft. Colonel Jackson, I want you to know that if you need a witness for any legal proceedings, I'm available. What happened here today was unconscionable. Marcus shook his hand firmly. Thank you for helping my daughter when I couldn't be here. Your intervention may have saved her life. The federal response continued to expand throughout the afternoon. FAA inspectors had arrived to examine the aircraft's pressurization systems, confirming that Olivia's explanation about different cabin pressures was indeed accurate. The first-class cabin maintained pressure equivalent to 6,200 feet altitude, while economy was calibrated to 8,300 feet. Exactly as she had explained to Rebecca, technical specialists were downloading data from Olivia's Novosphere unit, documenting the precise timeline of her deteriorating vital signs correlated with the timestamps from passenger videos. The evidence was creating an irrefutable record of how Rebecca's discriminatory actions had directly caused Olivia's life-threatening medical crisis. Federal agents were interviewing every passenger, creating a comprehensive witness record. The stories were remarkably consistent. Rebecca had questioned Olivia's right to be in first class, dismissed her medical documentation without proper examination, ignored clear signs of medical distress, and explicitly told her to move to the back of the plane where you belong. The investigation was proceeding at an unprecedented pace. Within 3 hours of the incident, federal officials had collected 27 video recordings from different angles, obtained statements from 43 passenger witnesses, secured all relevant medical telemetry data from Olivia's Novosphere unit, initiated a complete review of National Airways training protocols and discrimination complaint history, begun formal criminal proceedings against Rebecca Wilson under multiple federal statutes. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, a specialized team was working to stabilize Olivia's condition. Dr. James Hamilton, her longtime pulmonologist, had been called in immediately upon her arrival. The stress-induced pulmonary hypertensive crisis has caused measurable damage. Hamilton explained to Marcus in the private consultation room, her right ventricular strain indicators show a 27% increase from her baseline readings last month. The echocardiogram is showing new areas of myocardial stress that weren't present before. Marcus listened intently, his military training helping him maintain composure despite the devastating news. What does this mean for her long-term prognosis? Doctor, Hamilton's expression was grave. This kind of acute crisis accelerates the progression of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Based on the vascular imaging we've done, there's new scar tissue formation in her pulmonary arteries, similar to what we saw in Angela's final months. The comparison to his late wife hit Marcus like a physical blow. Are you saying this incident could have shortened my daughter's life expectancy? I'm saying the physiological stress response triggered by this discrimination incident has caused measurable, permanent damage to Olivia's pulmonary vascular system. And yes, that could potentially impact her long-term prognosis. We're seeing changes in her vascular structure that typically take months to develop. This medical evidence transformed what was already a serious civil rights violation into something far more grave. Rebecca Wilson's discriminatory actions hadn't just humiliated Olivia, they had potentially shortened her life expectancy. Dr. Hamilton prepared detailed documentation of the physiological impact, including before and after pulmonary scans showing the new vascular damage. These medical records would become central to the federal case being built against both Wilson personally and National Airways corporately. Back at O'Hare International Airport, Assistant Secretary Gonzalez had established a command center in Terminal 3, Conference Room A, coordinating the multi-agency response. Representatives from the FAA, FBI, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and Transportation Security Administration were all present, implementing what was now classified as a critical incident response priority. "We've discovered something troubling," an FAA data analyst reported, reviewing National Airways' passenger complaint database. In the past 24 months, National Airways has received 147 formal complaints about discriminatory seat verification incidents. Of these, 83% involve passengers of color, passengers with disabilities, or both. Dr. Gonzalez looked up sharply. "And how many of these complaints were substantiated by the airline?" "4," the analyst replied. "Less than 3%. And disciplinary action, taken in only 2 cases, both involving white passengers with political connections who escalated to the CEO's office." This statistical pattern was damning. It suggested not just individual discrimination by Rebecca Wilson, but a systemic failure to address bias throughout National Airways operations. Even more troubling were the internal communications uncovered when investigators accessed National Airways training materials and crew directives. One email from a senior training manager to cabin crew supervisors contained explicit instructions. "First-class presentation matters. Passengers in premium cabins expect a certain environment and clientele. It's your responsibility to ensure that the appropriate passengers are seated in the appropriate sections, especially during our investor demonstration flights." When presented with this evidence, Richard Whitman, National Airways Senior VP of Operations, could only offer weak explanations. "These communications do not reflect our corporate values or official policies," he insisted to federal investigators. "They represent individual lapses that we will address immediately." But the evidence suggested otherwise. The pattern was too consistent, the corporate response too inadequate, the training materials too ambiguous about what constituted appropriate verification versus discriminatory profiling. Meanwhile, Colonel Marcus Jackson was mobilizing his own federal resources. As Senior Operations Director at the FAA, he had the authority to implement emergency regulatory actions when public safety was at risk. "I'm invoking Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2025-47-9, he informed the federal response team. "Effective immediately, all commercial airlines must implement emergency refresher training on medical equipment, recognition, and passenger civil rights within 72 hours, or risk suspension of their operating certificates." Emergency airworthiness directives were normally reserved for critical safety issues like structural defects or mechanical failures. Using one for a civil rights and medical accommodation issue was unprecedented, but so was the severity of what had happened to Olivia. The directive required all airlines to conduct emergency training on medical equipment, recognition for all customer-facing personnel, implement immediate verification procedures for passengers with medical documentation, establish clear protocols for responding to medical device alarms, install visible signage, identifying approved medical equipment zones on all aircraft. "This isn't just about one airline or one flight attendant," Marcus explained to the team. "This is about preventing what happened to my daughter from happening to anyone else's child." The social media response continued to intensify. The hashtags #JusticeForOlivia and #Flight4721 were trending worldwide, with over 3.7 million posts in the first 5 hours. Celebrities were sharing the story, calling for accountability. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Disability advocacy groups were mobilizing supporters. National Airways' corporate crisis was deepening by the hour. Their stock had dropped 17.3% in a single afternoon of trading, representing nearly $3.8 billion in lost market value. Institutional investors were issuing statements of concern. Travel booking platforms reported a 42% decrease in new reservations for National Airways flights. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Olivia was finally stable enough to have visitors beyond her father. Michael Reynolds, whose intervention had been crucial during the incident, had asked to see her briefly. "I want to thank you," Olivia said when he entered her hospital room, her voice still weak but steady, "for standing up for me on the plane." Michael shook his head. "I just did what anyone should have done. I'm sorry others didn't step in sooner." "Most people don't get involved," Olivia observed with wisdom beyond her years. "They worry about the consequences for themselves." "The only consequence that mattered was your safety," Michael replied. "And I'm afraid I didn't do enough quickly enough." "You answered my father's call," Olivia reminded him. "That changed everything." Michael nodded, remembering the moment when the voice of federal authority had erupted from the phone, transforming the power dynamic instantly. "Your dad is quite formidable." Olivia smiled slightly. "He had to be. After my mom died, he promised he'd never let anything happen to me." The mention of her mother made Michael pause. "I'm so sorry about your mother. She had the same condition I do," Olivia explained. "That's why I want to become a biomedical engineer. I want to design better devices so people like me can live longer, more normal lives." The maturity and purpose in her words left Michael momentarily speechless. This child, who had just experienced traumatic discrimination in a life-threatening medical crisis, was focused not on herself but on how she could help others in the future. "Stanford would be lucky to have you," he said finally. Olivia's eyes brightened slightly. "My interview. I missed it." "Actually, Mom," Marcus said, entering the room, "Stanford has sent representatives here. They've requested to conduct your interview at the hospital once the doctors clear you for visitors." The news was a bright spot in what had been a devastating day. Despite everything, Olivia might still have her chance at the program that represented her future, both academically and medically. As Michael was leaving, a nurse entered with a tablet. "Olivia, there's something you should see, if you're feeling up to it." On the screen was a social media compilation. Thousands of people with chronic illnesses and disabilities were posting with the hashtag #FlyLikeOlivia, sharing their own stories of discrimination during travel. Parents of children with medical conditions were expressing solidarity. Medical equipment manufacturers were pledging to develop more recognizable devices to prevent similar misunderstandings. What had begun as a horrific incident of discrimination was catalyzing a national conversation about invisible disabilities, medical access, and racial bias in transportation. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old girl who had simply wanted to fly to her college interview without being questioned about whether she belonged in first class. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the pediatric intensive care unit was operating with heightened security. Federal agents stood outside Olivia's room, screening all visitors and maintaining a protective perimeter. This wasn't just any patient. This was the catalyst for what was quickly becoming the largest civil rights investigation in aviation history. Dr. Lena Ramirez, who had led the emergency response at O'Hare, was reviewing Olivia's vital signs with clinical precision, explaining the data to Dr. Hamilton and Colonel Jackson. "Her pulmonary arterial pressure has stabilized at 47 mmHg, Dr. Ramirez noted, pointing to the continuous monitoring display. "Still elevated, but significantly improved from the 78 mmHg we recorded on the aircraft. The intravenous epoprostenol has effectively relaxed her pulmonary vasculature." Dr. Hamilton nodded, studying the echocardiogram results. "Right ventricular function is improving, but there's still concerning strain. Ejection fraction is at 42%, compared to her baseline of 51%. Oxygen saturation is holding at 91.3%, not ideal, but recovering. The combination vasodilator therapy is working as expected." What made Olivia's case particularly concerning to the medical team was how quickly a stable patient had deteriorated under emotional distress. Pulmonary arterial hypertension was always dangerous, but Olivia's case demonstrated how social factors, in this case racial discrimination, could become immediate physical threats. "We're documenting everything for the federal investigation," Dr. Hamilton explained to Marcus. "These readings, scans, and test results establish a clear medical timeline that correlates perfectly with the discrimination incident. This will become medical evidence in both the regulatory action and any criminal proceedings. The data painted a disturbing picture. Olivia's baseline vital signs had been stable until Rebecca Wilson's first interaction. Each escalation in the confrontation corresponded with measurable deterioration in her cardiopulmonary function. The medical telemetry from her Novosphere unit, combined with witness testimonies and video recordings, created an irrefutable timeline of cause and effect. Meanwhile, at O'Hare International Airport, Gate C-17 had been transformed into a Federal Investigation Command Center. The gate area was cordoned off with official tape, and passengers from Flight 4721 were being systematically interviewed by federal agents. FBI Special Agent Thomas Hernandez was leading the witness interviews, carefully documenting each passenger's account of what they had seen and heard. The testimonies were remarkably consistent. The flight attendant kept saying the girl didn't belong in first class. She never really looked at her medical papers. When the medical device started alarming, she acted like it was an inconvenience rather than an emergency. She told the girl to move to the back of the plane where you belong. Those were her exact words. I heard her say first class was for premium passengers who actually paid, implying the girl hadn't paid for her ticket legitimately. Each statement was recorded, transcribed, and cross-referenced with video evidence to create a comprehensive timeline of the incident. The federal investigation was proceeding with unprecedented thoroughness and speed. Meanwhile, technical specialists were examining Olivia's medical equipment and documentation. FAA medical device certification expert Dr. Robert Chen confirmed that the Novosphere P478 was fully compliant with all aviation regulations and had been properly documented for the flight. This equipment was not just approved, it was exemplary in its compliance, Dr. Chen reported. The documentation Colonel Jackson filed exceeds FAA requirements in both detail and advance notice. National Airways Medical Compliance Office approved this specific configuration 45 days before the flight, well beyond the 30-day minimum requirement. The evidence collection process was comprehensive. Federal technicians had downloaded video from 27 different passenger phones, creating a multi-angle reconstruction of the entire incident. Audio engineers were enhancing recordings to document every word Rebecca had said. Digital forensics specialists were analyzing social media posts from passengers who had live-streamed the confrontation. The aircraft itself had been secured as a crime scene. Investigators were taking precise measurements of the first-class cabin pressure systems, the space occupied by Olivia's medical equipment, and the positioning of all relevant parties during the incident. The Novosphere unit occupied 432 cubic inches of space, reported FAA Inspector Maria Lopez. That's approximately 47% of the volume allocated for personal items in first class. The device was properly secured and positioned entirely within the passenger's designated space envelope. There was no obstruction of aisles, emergency exits, or adjacent passengers. This technical assessment directly contradicted Rebecca Wilson's claim that the equipment was taking up too much space and creating a hazard. Even more damning was the pressurization analysis. FAA technical specialists confirmed that the aircraft maintained different pressure environments in different cabins, exactly as Olivia had explained to Rebecca. First-class cabin pressure was maintained at 6,200 feet equivalent altitude, while economy was at 8,300 feet, confirmed aerospace engineer Jessica Torres. This 2,100-foot difference represents approximately a 7% change in effective oxygen availability. For a passenger with pulmonary hypertension, this differential is medically significant. This evidence confirmed that moving Olivia to economy class, as Rebecca had demanded, would indeed have created a medically dangerous situation requiring recalibration of her oxygen delivery system. National Airways corporate response team had expanded, now including the airline's general counsel, Maria Alvarez, who looked increasingly concerned as she reviewed the preliminary evidence. "This is catastrophic," she whispered to Richard Whitman. "We're looking at federal civil rights violations, ADA violations, Air Carrier Access Act violations, and potentially criminal negligence charges. The liability here is virtually unlimited." The airline's legal team was frantically calculating exposure. The civil penalties alone could exceed $14 million under federal aviation regulation penalties. The reputational damage was already in the billions. The potential criminal charges against Rebecca Wilson could result in substantial prison time, and the airline could be held vicariously liable for her actions. We need to get ahead of this, Whitman decided. Full cooperation with federal authorities, immediate termination of Wilson, comprehensive review of all training protocols, and a public statement taking full responsibility. But even as the corporate damage control began, the medical team at Northwestern was discovering something even more alarming. Detailed comparative analysis of Olivia's current condition with her mother, Angela's medical records revealed disturbing similarities in disease progression. Colonel Jackson, Dr. Button Hamilton said privately, away from Olivia's room, I need to be completely candid with you. This incident has caused a significant setback in Olivia's condition. The acute stress-induced vascular constriction has created new scar tissue in her pulmonary arteries. This is precisely the pattern we saw in Angela's case approximately 8 months before her final decline. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Are you saying this incident could have shortened my daughter's life by months? I'm saying the physiological stress response triggered by discrimination has caused measurable, permanent damage to Olivia's pulmonary system. The new lesions in her distal pulmonary arteries show characteristics of irreversible vascular remodeling. And yes, based on what we observed with Angela's case, this type of acute crisis typically accelerates disease progression by 6 to 18 months in patients with this genetic variant of PAH. The medical implications transformed what was already a serious civil rights violation into something far more grave. Rebecca Wilson's discriminatory actions hadn't just humiliated Olivia or temporarily endangered her. They had potentially shortened her life expectancy by altering the progression of her underlying disease. This medical evidence would become central to the federal case being built against both Wilson personally and National Airways corporately. Dr. Baum Hamilton prepared detailed documentation of the physiological impact, including before and after pulmonary scans showing the new vascular damage, right ventricular strain patterns, and comparative analysis with Olivia's previous baselines. At the FAA Command Center established at O'Hare, the federal response continued to expand. The investigation had now been classified as a critical incident response priority, a designation typically reserved for terrorist threats or major aviation disasters. Assistant Secretary Gonzalez from the Department of Transportation had assumed personal oversight of the civil rights investigation aspect. We're implementing Protocol 47 Delta, she informed the team, full regulatory review of National Airways with presumption of systemic noncompliance. Protocol 47 Delta was rarely invoked. It allowed federal regulators to examine every aspect of an airline's operations, from hiring practices to training protocols to cabin service procedures, all under the presumption that violations were systemic rather than isolated. National Airways will be required to prove compliance with every federal regulation rather than regulators having to prove noncompliance. Gonzalez explained to Marcus during a secure video call. The burden of proof is completely reversed. The airline's executives, realizing the existential threat this posed to their company, were scrambling to demonstrate cooperation. Richard Whitman had authorized full access to all company records, training materials, and personnel files without requiring subpoenas. We want to be part of the solution, Whitman insisted during an emergency meeting with federal officials. What happened to Olivia Jackson was inexcusable, and we're committed to ensuring it never happens again. But the social media firestorm was making it clear that corporate contrition might not be enough. The hashtag boycott National Airways was trending nationally. Celebrities were canceling their relationships with the airline. Institutional investors were issuing statements of concern about the company's future. The incident had struck a chord with the American public in a way that few corporate scandals ever did. Perhaps it was the image of a 12-year-old black girl fighting to breathe while being told she didn't belong. Perhaps it was the revelation that this brilliant child was interviewing for Stanford's biomedical engineering program. Or perhaps it was the unmistakable clarity of the discrimination, captured on dozens of phones from multiple angles, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Back at Northwestern Memorial, Olivia was receiving news that offered a glimmer of hope amid the trauma. Dean William Chen of Stanford's School of Engineering had arrived personally to conduct her interview, refusing to allow discrimination to derail her opportunity. Ms. Jackson, Dr. Chen said, sitting beside her hospital bed with the biomedical engineering program director. Under normal circumstances, we would never consider a 12-year-old for our program, regardless of academic qualifications. But your circumstances are extraordinary in every respect. The interview proceeded for over 2 hours, during which Olivia demonstrated her remarkable understanding of pulmonary support systems, engineering principles, and research methodologies. Despite her weakened condition, her mind remained sharp, her passion evident. Your proposal for miniaturized responsive oxygen delivery systems is genuinely innovative, Dr. Chen acknowledged. You've identified design limitations that our own researchers have been struggling with. Your personal experience gives you insights that purely academic researchers simply don't have. This moment, a prestigious university recognizing Olivia's extraordinary potential, even as she recovered from discrimination-induced trauma, captured the attention of millions following her story online. It represented both the tragedy of what had happened and the triumph of her indomitable spirit. As videos of the discrimination incident continued to spread across social media platforms, reaching over 47 million views within 24 hours, the public reaction intensified. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Medical associations called for improved training for transportation workers. Disability advocacy groups mobilized supporters. The story was no longer just about one flight attendant's actions or one child's suffering. It had become a national reckoning about who belongs where, whose needs matter, and how unconscious bias can have life-threatening consequences. And at the center of it all remained Olivia Jackson, a 12-year-old girl whose fight for breath had become a powerful metaphor for the broader struggle against discrimination in American society. The formal investigation into Flight 4721 proceeded with unprecedented speed and scope. Within 48 hours of the incident, federal authorities had compiled over 7,000 pages of evidence, including witness statements, video recordings, medical documentation, airline training materials, and corporate communications. Rebecca Wilson sat in interview room 3 at the O'Hare Federal Aviation Administration field office, facing Agent Hernandez and Assistant Secretary Gonzalez. Her airline-provided attorney looked increasingly concerned as the evidence against his client mounted. "Ms. Wilson," Agent Hernandez said, placing a tablet on the table between them, "we've compiled a comprehensive video record of the incident from 27 different passenger recordings. I'd like you to watch this compilation and then explain your actions." The video that played was devastating in its clarity. From multiple angles, it showed Rebecca approaching Olivia, questioning her seat assignment, dismissing her documentation, escalating the confrontation despite visible signs of medical distress, and ultimately making explicitly discriminatory statements. Most damning was the enhanced audio, which clearly captured Rebecca saying, "First class isn't for everyone. These seats are reserved for our premium passengers who've actually paid for first-class service, and you need to gather your things and move to the back of the plane where you belong." When the video ended, Rebecca stared at the blank screen, her face drained of color. "Would you care to explain your actions?" Agent Hernandez asked. I was concerned about passenger safety," Rebecca offered weakly. "At what point did a seated 12-year-old girl reading a textbook present a safety concern?" Assistant Secretary Gonzalez asked. "The medical equipment. The FAA approved properly documented medical equipment that was keeping her alive," Gonzalez interrupted. "The equipment that your airline's medical compliance officer had specifically authorized 45 days prior to the flight." Rebecca's attorney placed a cautioning hand on her arm, but she continued. "She didn't look like she should be in first class." The statement hung in the air, its naked bias impossible to disguise or walk back. "And what exactly should someone in first class look like?" "Ms. Wilson," Agent Hernandez asked. Rebecca's shoulders slumped. "I don't know. Not like her." "Not like her," Gonzalez repeated. "Not young, not black, not traveling alone." Which aspect of Olivia Jackson's appearance made you decide she didn't belong in a seat she had legally purchased and properly occupied? Rebecca had no answer. The investigation was expanding beyond Rebecca Wilson to examine National Airways as a corporate entity. Federal investigators had seized training records, complaint histories, and internal communications relating to passenger discrimination incidents. What they found was deeply troubling. National Airways had received 147 formal complaints about discriminatory seat verification in the previous 24 months. Of those complaints, 83% involved passengers of color, passengers with disabilities, or both. The airline had substantiated only 3% of these complaints, and had taken disciplinary action in only 2 cases. More disturbing were the internal emails discussing these incidents. Corporate communications revealed a culture that tacitly encouraged flight attendants to maintain cabin standards and ensure appropriate passenger placement, euphemisms that effectively sanctioned profiling based on appearance. One email from a training supervisor to cabin crew managers stated, "First-class presentation matters. Passengers in premium cabins expect a certain environment and clientele. It's your responsibility to maintain that atmosphere." When confronted with this evidence, Richard Whitman could only offer damage control. "These communications do not reflect our corporate values or official policies," he insisted to federal investigators. "They represent individual failures that we will address immediately." But the evidence suggested them otherwise. The pattern was too consistent, the corporate response too tepid, the training materials too vague about what constituted inappropriate discrimination. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Dr. Hamilton was preparing his formal medical testimony for federal prosecutors. His assessment was unequivocal. The discriminatory incident on Flight 4721 caused severe physiological stress that resulted in acute pulmonary hypertensive crisis in patient Olivia Jackson. The vascular constriction and resultant tissue damage are consistent with traumatic stress response. The new lesions observed in her pulmonary vasculature show characteristics of irreversible remodeling that typically accelerate disease progression by 6 to 18 months. Had emergency medical intervention not been available, this incident could have resulted in fatal cardiopulmonary collapse. In legal terms, this medical opinion transformed Rebecca Wilson's actions from discrimination to potentially criminal negligence under federal law 18 UPC 1112, which covered actions showing wanton or reckless disregard for human life. The legal implications were expanding rapidly. Rebecca Wilson now faced potential criminal charges for endangerment of a minor, federal civil rights violations, and criminal negligence. National Airways faced regulatory action under the Air Carrier Access Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and multiple FAA safety regulations. Individual executives could be charged with creating a discriminatory corporate culture and failing to properly train employees in federal requirements. By the 3rd day after the incident, the consequences began to materialize. Rebecca Wilson was formally terminated from National Airways with prejudice, meaning she was ineligible for rehire within the industry. The Department of Transportation imposed immediate enhanced monitoring requirements on all National Airways flights, requiring federal observers on randomly selected routes. The FAA issued Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2025-479, requiring all airlines to conduct emergency refresher training on medical equipment, recognition, and passenger civil rights. National Airways stock had fallen 37.2%, erasing nearly $8.4 billion in market value in just 3 trading sessions. A federal judge issued a preliminary order requiring National Airways to preserve all records relating to passenger complaints, crew training, and disability accommodation for the previous 5 years. But perhaps the most significant development came from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which announced a formal pattern or practice investigation into National Airways under Title 42, USC 14141. This rare type of investigation assumed systematic violations of constitutional rights and carried the potential for federal receivership, the government effectively taking control of the airline's operations if widespread discrimination was found. The Department of Justice filed formal criminal charges against Rebecca Wilson under multiple federal statutes. Violation of 18 U.S.C. 242, deprivation of rights under color of authority. Violation of 18 U.S.C. 1112, criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm. Violation of 42 S.C. 12101, Americans with Disabilities Act. Violations. Violation of 49 U.S.C. 41705, Air Carrier Access Act violations. If convicted on all counts, Rebecca faced up to 17 years in federal prison and fines exceeding $750,000. Her attorney immediately began negotiating a plea agreement, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against his client. National Airways was facing its own legal nightmare. Class action lawsuits were being filed by passengers with disabilities who had experienced discrimination, minority passengers who had been subjected to disparate treatment, shareholders alleging corporate negligence in training and oversight, advocacy organizations seeking systemic reform. The Federal Aviation Administration, under Colonel Jackson's authority, implemented Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2025-479, requiring all airlines to conduct emergency training on medical equipment, recognition within 72 hours, install new visible signage in all aircraft identifying approved medical device zones, implement mandatory medical accommodation, verification procedures at boarding, establish clear documentation protocols for passengers with invisible disabilities. This isn't just about one airline or one incident, Marcus explained at a press conference. This is about ensuring that what happened to my daughter never happens to anyone else's child. Meanwhile, Captain Lisa Rodriguez was cleared of direct wrongdoing, but received a formal reprimand for delayed intervention in a passenger safety emergency. Her statement to investigators revealed the underlying corporate culture that had enabled the incident. "We're trained to maintain a certain atmosphere in first class," she explained. "There's an unspoken expectation that we should be selective about who occupies those premium seats. It's never explicitly stated, but the message is clear: first class has a certain look, and it's our job to maintain it." This testimony became crucial evidence in the pattern or practice investigation, suggesting that discrimination wasn't just Rebecca Wilson's personal failing, but a systemic issue embedded in airline culture. Michael Reynolds, whose intervention had been critical during the incident, received formal recognition from the Department of Transportation for exemplary citizenship in defense of passenger civil rights. His witness statement and testimony were instrumental in establishing the timeline and severity of the discrimination. "I did what anyone should have done," he insisted when interviewed by federal investigators. "The real issue is why others didn't intervene sooner. There were dozens of witnesses to this discrimination, and most said nothing until the situation became life-threatening." This observation led to another key component of the emerging federal response: bystander intervention training requirements for airline staff and public education campaigns for passengers about reporting discrimination. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Olivia was recovering physically but still processing the emotional impact of the incident. Child psychologists specializing in racial trauma had been brought in to help her navigate the complex emotions of being discriminated against so publicly. "Olivia Dear Arbaram," Sarah Mendez asked during a therapy session, "how do you feel about all the attention this incident is receiving?" Olivia considered the question carefully. "I feel responsible, not for what happened, but for what happens next. People are watching. This could change things for other kids like me." "That's a heavy burden for someone your age," Dr. Mendez observed. "I've been carrying heavy burdens since I was 7, Olivia replied, gesturing to her medical equipment. "At least this one might help other people." Her resilience was remarkable, but the medical team remained concerned about the long-term psychological effects of such public trauma at a formative age. They recommended ongoing therapy and support, which Marcus immediately arranged. Meanwhile, Stanford University's response exceeded all expectations. Dean William Chen arrived personally at Northwestern Memorial to conduct Olivia's interview, bringing with him the director of the biomedical engineering program. "Ms. Jackson," Dr. Chen began, sitting beside Olivia's hospital bed. "Under normal circumstances, we would never consider a 12-year-old for our program, regardless of academic qualifications, but your circumstances are extraordinary in every respect." The interview proceeded for over 2 hours, during which Olivia demonstrated her remarkable understanding of pulmonary support systems, engineering principles, and research methodologies. Her personal experience with medical technology gave her insights that even seasoned professionals found valuable. "Your proposal for miniaturized responsive oxygen delivery systems is genuinely innovative," Chen acknowledged. "You've identified design limitations that our own researchers have been struggling with." 2 days later, Stanford made an unprecedented announcement. They were offering Olivia Jackson conditional early admission to their biomedical engineering program, with a full scholarship sponsored by their Medical Device Research Initiative. She would begin with online courses immediately and transition to campus-based education when medically appropriate and age-appropriate. This educational opportunity, born from the traumatic discrimination Olivia had experienced, represented a life-changing possibility, not just academic advancement, but access to cutting-edge research that could potentially extend her life expectancy. National Airways' corporate response evolved from damage control to comprehensive reform. Facing existential threats from federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and consumer boycotts, CEO James Peterson announced the most extensive corporate restructuring in aviation history, immediate termination of 3 senior executives responsible for training and cabin service protocols, creation of a new executive position, Chief Inclusion Officer, with direct reporting to the CEO, $47 million investment in bias training and disability accommodation programs, establishment of a $25 million victim compensation fund for passengers who had experienced discrimination, transparent public reporting of all discrimination, complaints and resolutions on a quarterly basis, implementation of the Jackson Protocol for passengers with medical needs, ensuring proper identification and accommodation. We failed Olivia Jackson, Peterson acknowledged in a public statement. We failed her as a passenger, as a child with medical needs, and as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. The changes we're implementing today are just the beginning of our commitment to ensuring this never happens again. But the most significant development came from the Department of Transportation, which announced the formation of the Aviation Passenger Rights Task Force, co-chaired by Assistant Secretary Gonzalez and Colonel Marcus Jackson. The task force was charged with developing comprehensive new regulations governing passenger civil rights protections across all airlines, medical equipment accommodation standards, disability access requirements, anti-discrimination training protocols, enforcement mechanisms for civil rights violations. These regulations would eventually become known as the Olivia Jackson Aviation Equality Act, the most sweeping passenger rights legislation in aviation history. As the investigation concluded its initial phase, the legal, regulatory, and corporate consequences continued to expand. What had begun as one flight attendant's discriminatory actions had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of how airlines treated passengers who didn't fit conventional expectations. And at the center of it all remained Olivia Jackson, a 12-year-old girl who had simply wanted to fly to her college interview without being questioned about whether she belonged in first class. 3 weeks after the incident on Flight 4721, Olivia Jackson sat in her bedroom, surrounded by the medical equipment that kept her alive and the academic materials that gave her purpose. Her physical recovery had been slower than expected, the stress-induced damage to her pulmonary system creating new challenges for her already compromised health. Her Novosphere readings had stabilized at new baselines: pulmonary arterial pressure at 52 mmHg, up from her previous 47 mmHg, oxygen saturation at 92, 1% down from 90.7%, and right ventricular ejection fraction at 47%, down from 51%. These numbers, while not immediately dangerous, told the story of a body that had endured significant trauma and would never quite be the same. "Dad," she called, hearing Marcus in the hallway outside her room. "Can we talk?" Marcus entered, immediately checking her Novosphere readings with the practiced glance of a parent who had learned to monitor medical data as instinctively as he once checked aircraft instruments. Oxygen saturation 92, 1%, heart rate 76 BPM, pulmonary pressure 52 mmHg, not perfect, but stable. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I've been thinking about what happened," Olivia said, her fingers absently adjusting the oxygen flow on her device. "Not just about me, but about other kids with medical conditions." Marcus nodded, giving her time to organize her thoughts. This had been Olivia's way since she was little, processing internally before expressing her conclusions with remarkable clarity. "What if other kids face the same thing, did?" she finally asked. "What if they don't have fathers who can ground airplanes?" The question hung in the air, its implications expanding beyond their personal experience to the systemic inequalities that determined who received justice and who didn't. "That's exactly what we're trying to address with the new regulations," Marcus assured her. "The Aviation Passenger Rights Task Force is developing standards that will protect everyone, regardless of who their parents are. But regulations take time," Olivia pointed out, "and they only work if they're enforced. What happens in the meantime? What about kids whose medical conditions aren't as visible as mine? What about people whose equipment doesn't look medical enough?" Marcus recognized the familiar determination in his daughter's eyes, the same determination that had helped her survive a condition that had taken her mother. "What are you thinking?" "I want to tell my story," Olivia said simply. "Not just for the federal investigation or the lawsuits, but for other kids who might not know their rights or how to protect themselves. This request led to a carefully managed media interview with respected journalist Diana Foster, known for her sensitivity in handling stories involving children and medical issues. The interview, broadcast nationally 3 days later, transformed the public understanding of what had happened on Flight 4721. "Olivia?" Diana asked, cameras capturing the medical equipment that hummed softly beside her. "Can you explain why you were traveling alone that day?" "I was flying to Stanford University for an early admission interview to their biomedical engineering program," Olivia explained, her composure remarkable for someone so young. "I want to design better life support systems for people with conditions like mine." "And you've flown many times before." 27 times, Olivia confirmed. "Always with the same documentation, always with medical approval, always in first class because of the cabin pressure requirements. The difference in altitude equivalent between cabins is approximately 2,100 feet, which represents a 7% change in effective oxygen availability. For someone with pulmonary hypertension, that difference is medically significant." "What was different this time?" Olivia paused, considering how to articulate what had happened. Without assigning motive she couldn't know with certainty. "This time, someone decided I didn't look like I belonged," she said finally. "Not because of my documentation or my ticket, but because of how I looked." "And how did that make you feel?" "Initially confused," Olivia admitted. "I had all the paperwork. My equipment was approved. My seat was confirmed. I couldn't understand why there was a problem." "When did confusion turn to fear?" "When my oxygen levels started dropping," Olivia explained, gesturing to her Novosphere unit. "Stress affects my condition directly. When my heart rate increases, my pulmonary vessels constrict. That reduces oxygen flow to my body and increases strain on my right ventricle. It's a dangerous cycle that can escalate quickly." "Were you aware you were in medical danger?" "Yes," Olivia said simply. "I could feel it happening. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. My pulmonary pressure rose from 47 mmHg to 78 mmHg in less than 20 minutes. That's a 66% increase, which indicates severe vasoconstriction. My oxygen saturation dropped from 93.7% to 74.2%, which is close to levels that can cause organ damage." The interview continued, Olivia describing the events with remarkable clarity and without apparent anger or resentment. She explained the medical implications of moving to a different cabin pressure environment, the documentation she had carried, and the physical symptoms she had experienced as the confrontation escalated. Most powerfully, she articulated the moment when she realized what was really happening. "When she said I needed to move to the back of the plane where you belong, I understood this wasn't about my medical equipment or my age or my ticket. This was about who she thought deserved to be in first class, and apparently that wasn't someone who looked like me." The interview humanized what had previously been reported primarily as a legal and regulatory story. Viewers saw not just a victim of discrimination, but a brilliant, composed young woman with extraordinary goals who had nearly died because of someone else's assumptions. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The interview was viewed over 23 million times within 48 hours. Donations to pulmonary hypertension research foundations increased by 1,700%. Stanford University received over $12 million in spontaneous donations to their medical device research programs, many specifically mentioning Olivia's name. But the most significant response came from other families whose children lived with invisible disabilities. Parents began sharing stories of similar discrimination their children had faced, not just on airplanes, but in schools, restaurants, public transportation, and healthcare facilities. #Invisible like Olivia became a movement, with thousands of families documenting instances where children with non-apparent medical conditions were questioned, challenged, or denied accommodations because they didn't look sick. This grassroots response expanded the scope of the emerging legislation beyond aviation to include broader protections for people with invisible disabilities in all forms of public accommodation. Meanwhile, Rebecca Wilson was facing the consequences of her actions. Having accepted a plea agreement to avoid a full trial, she received a sentence of 37 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The judge's statement made clear the severity of her actions. "Ms. Wilson, your discriminatory behavior wasn't just morally wrong, it was life-threatening. You endangered a child because of your biased assumptions about who belongs in which section of an aircraft. The medical evidence shows that your actions likely shortened this child's life expectancy. This sentence reflects not just the civil rights violations, but the physical harm your actions caused to a vulnerable minor. As part of her plea agreement, Rebecca was required to record a public service announcement about the dangers of discrimination against passengers with medical needs. The video, which would be shown during airline crew training nationwide, represented an unprecedented form of restorative justice in a federal criminal case. National Airways corporate transformation continued under federal supervision. The company's new chief inclusion officer, Dr. James Washington, a respected civil rights attorney and former Department of Justice official, implemented sweeping changes to hiring, training, and operational practices. Complete revision of all training materials to eliminate coded language about passenger profile and cabin atmosphere. Implementation of blind hiring practices for all customer-facing positions. Mandatory quarterly bias training for all employees, with particular emphasis on invisible disabilities. Creation of a passenger advocacy office with authority to override crew decisions in potential discrimination situations. Development of the industry's first comprehensive medical equipment identification guide, with detailed visual references for common life support devices. These changes, while initially motivated by legal necessity and public relations damage control, began to transform the corporate culture in measurable ways. Discrimination complaints decreased by 47% within the first 6 months. Passenger satisfaction scores among travelers with disabilities increased by 38%. Employee reporting of potential bias incidents rose by 82%, suggesting a new willingness to address problematic behaviors before they escalated. The most poignant moment in Olivia's recovery came 6 weeks after the incident, when she received a letter from Emily Wilson, Rebecca Wilson's 17-year-old daughter. "My mother did something terrible to you." The letter began, "Something inexcusable and dangerous. I'm writing not to ask for your forgiveness, but to tell you that your interview changed how I see the world. I never realized how assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces could literally threaten someone's life. Because of you, I'm applying to nursing school with a focus on working with patients with invisible disabilities." Olivia shared the letter with her father, her expression thoughtful. Her mom did something terrible, but that doesn't define her daughter's future. Just like having pulmonary hypertension doesn't define yours, Marcus observed. Olivia nodded. Exactly. This perspective, the refusal to be limited by others' actions or by her own medical condition, had become Olivia's defining characteristic. It was what had impressed the Stanford Admission Committee, what had touched millions of viewers, and what would continue to drive her remarkable journey. As spring turned to summer, Olivia's medical condition stabilized enough for her to begin her online coursework with Stanford. The university had created a specialized program that allowed her to participate in laboratory sessions remotely, using advanced virtual reality technology to manipulate experimental equipment from her home. Her first research project focused on developing medical equipment with unmistakable visual indicators of their life-supporting function, devices that could never be mistaken for consumer electronics or optional accessories. "I want to design medical devices that announce themselves," she explained to her academic advisor. "Equipment that makes it impossible for anyone to question whether it's essential or legitimate." This project would eventually lead to the development of the Jackson Visual Identification Protocol, a design standard that would transform medical device manufacturing industry-wide. But beyond her academic work, Olivia had become an unexpected voice for change. Her story had catalyzed not just regulatory reform, but a fundamental reassessment of how society treated people with non-apparent disabilities. The question she had asked her father, "What about kids who don't have fathers who can ground airplanes?" had become the foundation for a movement that extended far beyond aviation. 6 months after Flight 4721, Olivia Jackson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing the International Association of Flight Attendants annual conference. At 13, she was the youngest person ever invited to deliver a keynote at this prestigious event. The audience of 3,000 airline crew members fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, her Novosphere unit humming softly beside her. The device now featured a distinctive blue medical insignia and pulsating LED indicators developed as part of her Jackson Visual Identification Protocol, making it instantly recognizable as life-supporting medical equipment. I don't want anyone to lose their job because of what happened to me, Olivia began, her voice steady and clear. I want people to learn. I want you to understand that when you see a young person, or a person of color, or someone with medical equipment, you're not seeing a problem to solve. You're seeing a human being who deserves the same respect and dignity as every other passenger. The standing ovation began before she had finished speaking and continued for 5 full minutes. Flight attendants, many in tears, rose to their feet in recognition not just of Olivia's forgiveness, but of the truth in her words. This speech marked the beginning of the implementation phase of the Olivia Jackson Aviation Equality Act, the most comprehensive passenger rights legislation in aviation history. The act, which had passed Congress with rare bipartisan support by margins of 382-53 in the House and 87-13 in the Senate, included provisions that transformed how airlines operated. Mandatory medical equipment, recognition training. All airline personnel were required to complete 8 hours of training annually on recognizing and accommodating approved medical devices, with specific attention to 47 commonly used life support systems. Disability rights enforcement mechanisms. Airlines were required to designate passenger rights officers on every flight, with authority to override crew decisions in potential discrimination situations and direct access to federal reporting systems. Bias recognition certification. All customer-facing airline employees had to obtain federal certification in bias recognition and mitigation, renewable every 24 months, with specific testing on handling invisible disabilities. Federal penalties for discrimination. Civil penalties for discrimination against passengers with medical conditions were increased to $25,000 per incident and $150,000 for repeat violations, with criminal penalties available for cases involving endangerment. Passenger advocacy resources. Airlines were required to prominently display information about passenger rights and reporting procedures for discrimination incidents at check-in counters, boarding gates, and in seatback materials. The implementation of these regulations sent ripples throughout the airline industry. Initial compliance costs were estimated at $742 million across all domestic carriers, but the resulting improvements in passenger experience and reduction in liability exposure quickly demonstrated the business case for inclusive practices. The statistics told a compelling story of systemic change. Incidents involving passengers with medical equipment decreased by 83.7% in the first year. Discrimination complaints related to seating assignments dropped from 4,792 to 873 annually. Medical emergency incidents caused by crew interference were reduced from 127 annually to just 3. Customer satisfaction scores among passengers with disabilities increased by 42.3%. Airline liability insurance premiums decreased by 17.4% due to reduced discrimination claims. But the most profound changes were cultural rather than statistical. Flight attendants reported feeling more confident in identifying legitimate medical equipment. Passengers with invisible disabilities described feeling safer when traveling. Airlines discovered that inclusive practices improved the travel experience for all passengers, not just those with specific needs. Rebecca Wilson, serving her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Waseca, Minnesota, had become an unlikely ally in the fight against discrimination. After completing intensive therapy and bias training, she volunteered to participate in a documentary about unconscious bias in service industries. I never thought of myself as racist, Rebecca admitted in the film, which became required viewing in airline training programs. But when I saw Olivia in first class, my first assumption was that she didn't belong there. I didn't see her documentation, didn't notice her medical equipment, didn't listen to her explanations. I just saw a young black girl and decided she was out of place. The documentary, titled Invisible Barriers, won several awards and was incorporated into training programs beyond aviation, including healthcare, education, and hospitality industries. Michael Reynolds, whose intervention had been crucial during the incident, established the Bystander Action Foundation, which developed training programs for recognizing and responding to discrimination in public spaces. The Foundation's first initiative was the creation of the Speak Up Protocol, a simple 4-step process for intervention when witnessing bias in action. National Airways, under new leadership and federal supervision, transformed from industry laggard to leader in inclusive practices. The airline invested $83 $4 million in redesigning its entire approach to passenger services, creating the gold standard for accommodation and accessibility. Most significantly, the airline established the National Airways Inclusion Academy, which provided free training to other transportation providers on implementing the requirements of the Olivia Jackson Aviation Equality Act. We learned our lesson the hard way. New CEO Dr. Maria Alvarez acknowledged what? Now we have an obligation to help others avoid making the same mistakes. The technology improvements inspired by Olivia's experience extended far beyond regulatory compliance. Medical device manufacturers, recognizing the potential market advantage of clearly identifiable life support equipment, developed new visual standards that made essential medical devices instantly recognizable to untrained observers. The Jackson Visual Identification Protocol, which Olivia had developed initially as a Stanford research project, was adopted by major manufacturers including Medtronic, Philips Healthcare, and Boston Scientific. The protocol established consistent visual markers, specific color patterns, universal symbols, and pulsating LED indicators that identified life-supporting equipment across all brands and models. This standardization not only reduced discrimination incidents, but improved emergency response times by making critical equipment immediately identifiable to first responders. The protocol was credited with saving 47 lives in its first year of implementation by reducing confusion during medical emergencies. 2 years after Flight 4721, Olivia Jackson became the youngest person ever to testify before Congress, advocating for the extension of the Aviation Equality Act's protections to other forms of public transportation. The principles we've established in aviation should apply everywhere, she argued, her composure and articulation belying her 14 years. Whether someone is boarding a plane, a train, a bus, or entering a restaurant or hotel, their right to necessary medical equipment should be unquestioned and protected. The resulting legislation, commonly known as the Transportation Equality Amendment, extended federal civil rights protections to all forms of public transportation and accommodation, creating consistent standards for medical device accommodation nationwide. Olivia's medical journey continued in parallel with her advocacy work. The stress-induced damage from the Flight 4721 incident had created new challenges in managing her pulmonary hypertension, requiring adjustments to her treatment protocols and medication regimens. But her access to Stanford's research resources had opened new possibilities. She was participating in a clinical trial of an experimental vasodilator therapy developed specifically for pediatric pulmonary hypertension patients. The preliminary results were promising, showing a 17.2% improvement in pulmonary arterial pressure and a 23.4% increase in exercise capacity. This treatment, if ultimately successful, could potentially extend her life expectancy by years, giving her more time to develop the next generation of life support technologies she had dedicated herself to creating. On the second anniversary of Flight 4721, Olivia received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of her contribution to civil rights and disability advocacy. At 14, she was the youngest recipient in the medal's history. Olivia Jackson turned discrimination into systematic change, the president said during the ceremony. When faced with prejudice that threatened her life, she responded not with anger, but with a determination to ensure no one else would face the same danger. Her legacy isn't just in the laws and regulations that bear her name, but in the countless lives that will be protected because of her courage. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Olivia what she considered her greatest achievement so far. The fact that most people now recognize medical equipment for what it is, she replied without hesitation. Not as something suspicious or unusual, but as something essential that keeps people alive. This simple statement captured the essence of the transformation Olivia had helped create, a world where life-supporting medical technology was recognized, respected, and accommodated without question, regardless of who was using it. As she continued her education at Stanford, participating remotely while managing her condition, Olivia maintained perspective about her unexpected role in civil rights history. "I never set out to change aviation regulations," she told her online classmates during a virtual discussion. "I just wanted to get to my college interview without being questioned about whether I belonged in my seat." That simple desire to exist in spaces without having to justify her presence had resonated with millions of people who had experienced similar challenges. The question of who belongs in which spaces had become part of a national conversation about inclusion, accessibility, and unconscious bias. Flight 4721 had been delayed by 6 hours that day as federal authorities responded to the discrimination incident. But the changes it created had made air travel safer and more dignified for millions of passengers with medical needs. That was a delay that saved lives. 3 years after the incident, the Aviation Equality Project, a nonprofit organization established to monitor implementation of the Olivia Jackson Act, published its findings. An estimated 12,437 serious medical incidents had been prevented by the new protocols and training requirements. Discrimination complaints across all forms of transportation had decreased by 67.8%. Industry investment in accessibility and accommodation had increased by 342%. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of impact came from a simple observation. Flight attendants no longer questioned passengers with medical equipment about their seating assignments based on appearance. Medical devices were recognized and accommodated without suspicion. Invisible disabilities were acknowledged and respected. Olivia Jackson, now 15 and continuing her biomedical engineering studies, had transformed a moment of discrimination into a movement that protected thousands of vulnerable travelers. Her father had used his federal authority not just to protect his daughter, but to create systemic change that outlasted any individual incident. And the flight attendant who had nearly killed her with prejudice had become, ironically, part of the solution. Her documented discrimination now serving as a powerful teaching tool in training programs nationwide. The most profound legacy of Flight 4721 wasn't in the regulations or technologies it inspired, but in the fundamental shift in perspective. It created the recognition that questioning someone's right to exist in a space based on their appearance wasn't just rude or unfair. It could be literally life-threatening. The lesson that 12 Years a Slave taught about how casual dehumanization enables lethal violence. Every time a passenger with medical equipment boarded a flight without being challenged, every time a child with an invisible disability received proper accommodation, every time someone chose understanding over assumption, Olivia Jackson's legacy grew stronger. Her story had become a testament to the power of dignity in the face of discrimination, of expertise in the face of ignorance, of systemic change in the face of individual prejudice. And it had all begun with 3 words from a flight attendant to a 12-year-old girl: you need to move. If you were moved by this story, here's how you can help make a difference. Hit that like button right now to support the stories that expose discrimination and celebrate resilience. Your engagement helps us reach more people with these important messages. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of Black excellence, courage, and justice. We're dedicated to sharing narratives that inspire change and challenge biases. Share this video with friends, family, and colleagues. The more people who understand the dangers of discrimination against those with invisible disabilities, the safer our world becomes for everyone. Comment below with your own experiences or thoughts. Have you witnessed discrimination based on appearance? Have you or someone you love dealt with an invisible disability? Your story matters in this ongoing conversation. Together, we can create a world where no one is questioned about whether they belong based on how they look. A world where medical needs are respected, not doubted. A world where dignity is the default, not the exception. Remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't just fighting back. It's creating systemic change that protects everyone who comes after you.